Welcome back to Terrified Tales, where the rain falls slow and the fear creeps in quicker. Like and subscribe before we begin, and tell us where and when you're listening. Midnight, alone, that's when they find you. Ilara Monroe stood at the edge of Bell Hollow, her breath shallow and heavy in the cool mountain air. The town hadn't changed much since she left over a decade ago. The same rusted street lamps, the same fog that never seemed to lift, and the same eerily quiet atmosphere that had haunted her childhood. Bell Hollow had always been a place of whispers, where the locals traded more rumors than truths, and where the line between reality and superstition was as thin as the mist that clung to the streets. Her mother's house stood at the edge of the town, a faded Victorian mansion that looked as if it could crumble into the earth at any moment. Ilara had inherited it when her mother died, a death that still clung to her like an old, unwanted coat. She hadn't wanted to return, not to this place, not to the memories, but she had no choice. The house, like her mother's death, demanded attention. She gripped the cold brass doorknob, hesitated, and then stepped inside. The house smelled like dust and the remnants of something old, something forgotten. The floorboards creaked under her feet, and the shadows seemed to deepen with each step she took, as though the house itself was breathing, watching her. The only thing that had ever felt out of place in the house was the bell, an old, cracked brass bell that her mother had kept hidden away in the attic. Ilara could still remember the sound, a low, mournful toll that seemed to echo through her childhood nightmares. Her mother had always told her it was nothing more than an antique, a relic of the past. But Ilara had never believed her. That bell had been the source of so many strange things. The way her mother would sometimes sit in the dark, staring at the bell as if listening to something only she could hear. The nights when Ilara would wake to the sound of it ringing, deep and resonant, even though she knew the bell was locked away. A chill ran through her, but she shook it off. It had to be the stress, the exhaustion of the long drive. It had been a year since her mother's passing, a year filled with unanswered questions, and the last thing she needed now was to fall prey to old fears. But then, as she moved deeper into the house, she heard it. At first it was soft, just a faint ringing, like a distant wind chime on a far-off hill. But it grew louder, more distinct, like the echo of a bell tolling deep inside the walls. Ilara stopped. The sound was coming from upstairs, from the attic, the place where her mother had kept the bell. She stared at the staircase leading up to the attic, and for a moment the air seemed to grow thick around her. The ringing grew louder, more insistent, reverberating through the house. It was impossible. The bell hadn't been touched since her mother's death. The sound shouldn't exist. With trembling hands, Ilara took a step forward, her feet moving, slowly, as though the house itself were resisting her movement. The ringing grew louder still. She gritted her teeth, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had to find out what it was. She had to prove to herself that it was just her imagination. She climbed the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. The hallway at the top was dim, lit only by the faint light filtering through a dusty window. The sound of the bell was now almost deafening, filling the air around her like an oppressive presence. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached the attic door. It was ajar. With a force she didn't understand, Ilara pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was as she remembered, cluttered with old furniture, forgotten mementos of a life long past. Dust particles danced in the narrow beams of light, but there in the center of the room stood the bell. The bell was in its usual place on the pedestal, its tarnished surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. But it wasn't just the bell that made Ilara's heart race. It was the fact that it was ringing, the deep, resonant tone vibrating in the very air around her. No one had touched it. It had no reason to be ringing, and yet, there it was. "Mom," Ilara whispered. her voice trembling. She stepped closer, almost hypnotically, drawn to the sound. The bell continued to toll, its mournful sound filling the attic. She reached out a hand, her fingers brushing against the cold brass. The ringing stopped. The silence was so sudden, it nearly knocked the breath out of her. Ilara stood frozen, her fingers still pressed against the bell. The air felt thick, like the space around her was holding its breath. She pulled her hand back slowly, her mind racing. This wasn't possible. There was no explanation for it. The bell couldn't ring on its own, not after all this time. And yet, she heard it. It wasn't in the attic anymore, it was in her head. The sound of the bell was no longer confined to the physical space. It was inside her, reverberating through her skull. Each toll was like a pulse, a heartbeat that grew faster, louder. The ringing was moving closer to her, suffocating her thoughts, filling the void left by her mother's absence. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The air grew still, and the house returned to its eerie silence. Ilara stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't understand what had just happened, but she felt it, deep in her bones. The bell was calling to her, and no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, she knew that the bell's echo was never going to stop. It was only the beginning. Ilara sat in the dusty old armchair by the window, her fingers absently tracing the rim of the teacup in front of her. The ringing in her head had faded for the moment, but its absence left a hollow, unsettled quiet that felt just as oppressive. She stared out over the fog-clad town of Bell Hollow, its crumbling rooftops half swallowed by the mist, the streets shrouded in a stillness that almost seemed unnatural. Her mind kept drifting back to the attic, to the bell. How could it have rung by itself? The sound had been so real, so sharp, and yet there was no explanation. It wasn't possible. Her heart hammered in her chest just thinking about it. She had to find out what was happening here. She couldn't stay in the dark anymore. With a sigh, she stood and set the teacup aside, her eyes lingering on the fireplace where the dim, flickering embers threw long shadows across the room. It was time to see what she could uncover. The house had hidden too many things, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something her mother hadn't told her, something buried in the forgotten corners of Bell Hollow. The sound of footsteps approached the front door. A knock. Ilara's pulse quickened, and she instinctively glanced toward the hallway. Who would be visiting her this early? She hadn't made any plans. Hesitant, she walked toward the door and opened it. Standing on the threshold was a tall figure with a familiar, disheveled appearance, Jasper Vale. His dark hair was tousled, and his clothes, once neat, now looked as though they had been worn for days. His face was drawn, his eyes distant, as if he had been wrestling with something for a long time. "Jasper?" Ilara said, her voice soft with a mixture of surprise and unease. "What are you doing here?" He gave a faint, strained smile. "I thought I'd stop by. I heard about your return." His eyes shifted briefly to the house behind her, a look of quiet unease crossing his features. "I thought you might want company. There's something about this place." Ilara stepped aside to let him in, her mind already churning with questions. She hadn't spoken to Jasper in years, not since they had both left Bell Hollow, separated by the weight of the town's strange legacy. Their paths had diverged, but there was a part of her that had always found comfort in the familiarity of his presence. Once inside, Jasper glanced around, his eyes drawn to the faded wallpaper, the worn furniture. "It hasn't changed much," he said quietly. His voice carried a strange tension, as if the house itself unsettled him, and Ilara couldn't help but notice the way he avoided looking at the attic door. Ilara couldn't take it any longer. "Jasper, about the bell." He froze, his gaze snapping to hers, his expression clouded. "The bell?" She nodded, her heart pounding again. I heard it. It was ringing. In the attic. Jasper's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he didn't speak. Then, in a low voice, he said, "You shouldn't be messing with it, Ilara. The bell's connected to something much darker than you think." Ilara's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" "My mother always said it was just an antique, a relic." "Your mother," Jasper said almost under his breath, "wasn't telling you everything. There's more to that bell than you understand." He looked around again, his eyes searching for something hidden in the shadows. I've been looking into it, you know. The history of this town. There's stuff here they don't want you to know." "Stuff your mother tried to bury?" Ilara's curiosity sparked, despite the growing dread in her chest. "What are you talking about?" Jasper hesitated, his fingers fidgeting at his side. "I've found some old records, archives hidden, in the town hall. Stories about the bell, about the people who died because of it. Bell Hollow was founded on blood, Ilara. There's a reason why the bell was kept ringing, a reason why they silenced it after your mother." He stopped abruptly, and his eyes darkened. He swallowed hard, as if grappling with the weight of what he was about to say. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about the bell," Jasper continued, his voice shaking slightly. "He always said it was a keeper. It held something. Spirits, maybe. Lost souls. And when it was rung, it tied people to it. You know, people who died in unnatural ways, murders, accidents. And then it kept calling them, kept pulling them back." Ilara took a step back, her chest tightening. "My mother was she one of them?" Jasper nodded slowly, his face pale. "Yes, but she was also part of the reason why the bell kept tolling. She was involved in something that had to be stopped. I don't know the full story, but I've seen the names in the old records. Her name was in there. The room seemed to close in on her. Her mother, the woman who had always tried to protect her, was tangled up in something much darker than Ilara had ever imagined. It made her feel like she was drowning, trapped in a legacy she couldn't escape. Jasper, why didn't you tell me any of this before?" Ilara asked, her voice breaking. "I wasn't sure you'd believe me," he admitted, his eyes falling to the floor. "And I didn't want to drag you back into this. But now, with you here..." He trailed off, his expression haunted. "I think it's waking up again, Ilara. The bell. Something's stirring. And it's not just memories. It's alive." Ilara swallowed hard, her throat dry. The weight of the bell's history, its ominous past, pressed on her chest. She had to know more. "I need to see those records, Jasper," she said, determination building in her voice. "I need to understand." Jasper nodded solemnly. "I'll take you, but you need to be careful. Bell Hollow wasn't just built on rumors. There's truth buried here, and the more you dig, the harder it'll be to escape." Ilara's thoughts whirred as she nodded, stepping back toward the door. I have no choice. If this bell is connected to my mother's death, I need to know why. I need to know the truth." With one last glance around the house, Ilara followed Jasper out into the foggy street, the ringing of the bell faint in her ears. She didn't realize it yet, but the truth she sought would not set her free. It would drag her deeper into Bell Hollow's shadows, and she would soon learn that some truths are better left buried. Ilara sat in the small town hall, the dusty shelves around her lined with old ledgers, forgotten papers, and brittle maps of Bell Hollow. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and mothballs, and the light filtering through the high windows cast long, muted shadows across the room. Jasper was beside her, his eyes scanning through the old records they had uncovered, his fingers trembling slightly as he flipped through pages covered in yellowed ink. "Ilara, I don't know if I can..." Find anything more in here, Jasper said, his voice strained. His hands seemed unsteady as he turned over yet another page. Most of it's been sealed. There are names missing, entire sections torn out. Whoever controlled the bell made sure the worst parts of the town's history were erased. Ilara leaned forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of their search was becoming unbearable the more she learned. Each record they uncovered seemed to feed the growing sense of dread that gnawed at her insides. The bell wasn't just some relic of the past. It was a keeper of secrets, and the secrets were beginning to wrap themselves around her, like a tightening noose. Keep looking, Ilara urged, her voice quieter than she intended. There has to be something. My mother, she was involved in this. I need to know everything. Jasper nodded and resumed his search, but his face betrayed his unease. Ilara could feel the tension between them, the unspoken weight of the history they were trying to unravel. The bell was more than just a physical object. It was a curse, a pull on the soul that no one seemed to escape. Ilara's mind drifted back to the sound of the bell ringing in her head, the relentless tolling that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Jasper, she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Have you ever heard it? The bell, I mean. Have you heard it ring? He froze, his fingers halting on the page. For a moment, the air in the room felt heavier, as if the very walls were listening to their conversation. Finally, Jasper spoke, his voice low and hesitant. I have, he said quietly. I've heard it. In the dead of night. When I was a kid, I used to hear it, even though it had supposedly been silenced. But it wasn't like a regular bell. It was different. Distorted. Like it was coming from somewhere deep underground. Like it was calling to you. Ilara shivered, her hands curling into fists in her lap. I'm hearing it now, the ringing, but it's not in the house anymore. It's in my head. It's always there. Jasper's eyes darted to hers, and Ilara could see the fear in them. He knew what she was talking about. He had felt it too. Thought it was just me at first, he admitted. I thought I was going crazy. But then I realized it wasn't just in my head. It's the bell. It doesn't stop. It keeps calling. The thing is, I think it's trying to reach you, Ilara. I think it wants you. Ilara's heart lurched. She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor. She couldn't sit there any longer, trapped in this room full of history and unanswered questions. She needed to breathe, to get out of the suffocating silence that was pressing down on her. It's not just the bell, is it? She said, her voice trembling as she turned to Jasper. There's something more to it. Something that happened. Something my mother was a part of. Jasper swallowed hard. Ilara, we don't have all the pieces yet, but I think you're right. Your mother was involved in something dangerous. It's connected to the bell, to the deaths that happened here. He stood up, walking toward a dusty bookshelf in the corner of the room. There's a file, an old one. I was hoping I wouldn't have to show you. It's got her name on it, Ilara. But it's not just about her. It's about the others. About the people who died because of the bell. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She felt like she was being dragged deeper into a nightmare that was unfolding one horrifying piece at a time. Her mother had kept so many secrets, and now those secrets were catching up with her. Jasper pulled a thick file from the shelf and handed it to her. The file was wrapped in a faded leather strap, old and brittle with age. Ilara hesitated before she opened it, the weight of the moment settling over her like a dark cloud. She could feel her pulse quicken as she carefully untied the strap and opened the file. Inside were old newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and a series of faded photographs. She scanned through the first few pages, her hands shaking as she pieced together the fragments of information. Her mother's name appeared again and again, in relation to unexplained deaths in Bell Hollow, deaths that seemed to be linked to the bell. There were mentions of a ritual, a sacrifice that was supposed to silence the bell forever. The pages were filled with contradictions, half-truths, and things that didn't quite add up. But one name stood out among the others: Thomas Hale. "Who's Thomas Hale?" Ilara whispered, pointing to the name on the page. Jasper's face darkened. He was one of the first people to die because of the bell. He was a town founder, but there's something strange about him. His name kept appearing in the town's history, in connection with your mother's family, but it's all hidden now, all erased. Ilara's eyes narrowed. What did he have to do with the bell? "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Jasper replied. "But I think he was involved in some kind of dark pact, something that made the bell what it is. Your mother," his voice faltered, "she tried to stop it, but I think she got caught in it. And now it's calling you, Ilara, because you're the last one. The last one." The words echoed in her mind like the tolling of a bell, deep and unsettling. She looked at the photographs, at her mother's face staring back at her, haunted and tired, and felt the weight of the past pressing down on her chest. Ilara shut the file, her hands trembling. "I need to see this place, the church, where the bell used to be. I need to understand why it's calling me." Jasper looked at her, his eyes full of concern. "Are you sure? The bell? It's not just a thing. It's a force, Ilara, and if it's calling you, it's because you're tied to it. The truth won't set you free. It'll only pull you in deeper." Ilara stood up, her resolve hardening. "I don't care. I need to know everything. I need to know why it's haunting." "Me?" Jasper sighed but nodded. "Then let's go. But be careful, Ilara. You don't know what you're walking into." As they left the town hall and stepped into the misty streets of Bell Hollow, Ilara could feel the bell's pull growing stronger, its sound ever present in the back of her mind. She didn't know how much longer she could resist. She didn't know if she even wanted to, but she had to go. For her mother. For herself. The bell was waiting. The air was cold as Ilara and Jasper walked through the fog-cloaked streets of Bell Hollow. The town had always felt like it was on the edge of existence, a place suspended in time, untouched by the world outside. The fog seemed to crawl between the cobblestones, swirling around them like a thick living thing. The silence, broken only by the distant sound of wind chimes and the occasional groan of an old house settling, pressed down on them, heavy and suffocating. Ilara's heart was racing, her thoughts consumed by the file Jasper had shown her. Her mother's name kept appearing in those faded pages, tied to the bell, tied to deaths that shouldn't have happened. But there was so much more she didn't understand. The bell wasn't just a tool of memory, it was something far darker, a curse that lingered over the town, and now it had its hold on her. As they neared the old church, Ilara's chest tightened. The towering silhouette of the building loomed ahead, its stained glass windows like dark, empty eyes staring out into the mist. The bell tower was now a hollow shell, the bell itself gone. But Ilara could still feel its presence, like an invisible weight pressing down on the church. Jasper stopped in front of the large wooden doors, his hand hovering over the handle, as if hesitant to enter. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low and uncertain. "Once we go in, there's no turning back. The bell's history, it's all here, and it might not let us leave." Ilara stared at the doors, her hand resting against the cool wood. "I have to know. I need to understand what happened here, why it's still calling me. My mother, she didn't just die, Jasper. Something happened. Something she tried to hide." Jasper's eyes flickered with a mix of fear and understanding. He nodded slowly, pushing open the door. The sound of it creaking echoed through the empty church, like a groan from the very walls themselves. The interior of the church was as Ilara remembered from her childhood. Dim, with high ceilings and rows of pews that seemed untouched by time. The air smelled of incense, dust, and something older, something rotten. The atmosphere was thick, oppressive, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Or someone. Ilara stepped inside, her boots echoing in the stillness. She felt the familiar chill of the place wash over her, like a wave of coldness that seeped into her bones. The bell tower loomed above them, a hollow reminder of what had been and what was still missing. What now? Ilara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jasper looked around, his face taut with uncertainty. We need to go up there, to the bell tower. That's where everything started. The bell was never just a bell. It was a marker, a way to keep the spirits in check. But it didn't work. People died because of it. Your mother was part of that. Ilara shuddered, her mind racing with the weight of what he was saying. Her mother, the woman who had raised her in this very church, had been involved in something that had tied the town's fate to the bell. The thought of it twisted in her stomach, her thoughts laced with fear and disbelief. Together, they ascended, the narrow, creaking staircase that spiraled up toward the bell tower. The walls seemed to close in around them, the air growing colder with each step. Ilara's breath came in shallow gasps, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She could almost hear the faint tolling of the bell, though she knew it wasn't there. Not physically, but it was everywhere, in the silence, in her mind. At the top of the stairs, they reached the tower door. Ilara reached for the handle, her fingers trembling as she turned it. The door opened with a loud groaning sound, and the smell of decay hit her in waves. The room was bathed in dim light from the narrow windows, casting shadows that stretched, long, across the dusty floor. In the center of the room stood the remnants of the bell's platform, now a dark, empty space. Jasper stepped inside first, his eyes scanning the area with caution. Ilara followed, her gaze sweeping over the remains of the bell tower. She could almost feel the bell's presence, as if it was still there, pulsing in the very air around her. "This is where it all happened," Jasper said, his voice hushed. "The bell, the people who died, it all started here." Ilara moved toward the platform, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She could feel the weight of the space, the history of death that had been anchored here. And then her eyes fell on something she hadn't expected to see. There, in the corner of the room, was a small, worn notebook, its pages yellowed with age. She approached it slowly, her fingers reaching out to touch the fragile leather cover. She opened it, and her breath caught in her throat. The handwriting was her mother's. The pages were filled with notes, sketches, and what appeared to be a series of rituals. Ilara turned the pages with trembling hands, her heart pounding. The words were cryptic, filled with symbols and phrases she couldn't quite understand, but one word stood out: sacrifice. A chill ran down her spine. The last page contained a sketch of the bell. Its shape was distorted, twisted in a way that made Ilara's stomach churn. And beneath it, written in her mother's handwriting, were the words, "The bell must never toll again. The price will be too high." Ilara's pulse quickened as she read the words over and over. "Jasper, this is my mother's handwriting. She knew what was happening." Jasper's face had gone pale. He stepped closer, glancing over her shoulder at the pages. She knew all right. She knew what the bell was capable of. The bell wasn't just calling the dead, it was trapping them. It was feeding on their souls, keeping them in a never-ending loop. And your mother, she was part of that. Ilara's mind was racing. The rituals, the warnings, the sacrifice. It was all too much. How could her mother have been involved in something like this? Had she known the price would be so high? And why hadn't she told Ilara? Suddenly, the air grew colder, and Ilara felt a sharp, almost physical pressure pressing down on her chest. The bell, though gone, was still there, a presence that filled the room. It was as though it was watching her, waiting. The faint ringing started again. This time it wasn't just in her head. The tolling echoed through the tower, deep and mournful, like a voice from the past calling her name. Ilara. Ilara. Her mother's voice? No, it couldn't be. Ilara's breath caught and she turned toward Jasper. "Do you hear that?" Jasper's face was pale, his lips trembling. "It's the bell," he whispered. "It's not done with you. It never was." The ringing grew louder until it was deafening, and Ilara felt the ground beneath her shift. The tower seemed to tremble, the walls closing in on her, as if the bell's power was reaching out to claim her. Her heart raced, and she gripped the notebook tightly in her hands. "We need to leave. We need to get out of here." But as she turned to leave, a shadow moved in the corner of her eye, a fleeting figure too fast for her to follow. She froze, her body locking in place, the sound of the bell growing louder. More insistent. "Ilara, we need to go," Jasper urged, grabbing her arm, but she couldn't move. Something was holding her there, a force she couldn't explain, pulling her deeper into the church, into the heart of the curse. And then, as the bell's tolling grew louder still, she heard it again. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, brushing against her ear. "You're not alone." Ilara's breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding against her ribcage as the shadow in the corner of the bell tower seemed to pulse with a dark energy. She tried to move, to run, but her legs felt frozen, like they were tethered to the ground. The faint whisper, "You're not alone," echoed in her ears, its tone both comforting and terrifying at the same time. She felt the bell's presence like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, its pull undeniable, as if the tower itself were alive, watching her every move. "Jasper!" Ilara gasped, her voice shaking. "We need to leave, now." Jasper, standing a few feet away, seemed to be caught in his own trance. His wide, pale eyes flicked between her and the dark shadow in the corner. His hand reached for her, but he hesitated, as if unsure of what to do. He was just as trapped as she was, caught in the bell's influence. Ilara could see the fear in his eyes. He understood, perhaps more than she did, that the bell was more than just an object. It was a force, an ancient presence that had its hold on Bell Hollow long before they had arrived. "Ilara, we can't leave," Jasper murmured, his voice thick with terror. "Not until we understand what's happening here. We're part of this now. The bell's already called to us. We can't escape it." "No," Ilara said, her voice low and desperate, as the tolling of the bell began to intensify. "I don't care. We need to get out of here. It's too dangerous." "You don't understand." But before she could finish, the ground beneath them shook, and a low, vibrating hum filled the air, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The bell tower groaned, and the walls trembled as though something massive were moving inside the structure. Ilara stumbled backward, her pulse racing. Jasper's face twisted in horror as he reached out and grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the stairs. "It's already too late. The bell has awakened. We need to understand it, or we're both trapped here." The sound of the bell, deep and hollow, vibrated through their very bones. It wasn't just an echo in the tower anymore. It was alive. The room spun as the ringing grew louder, as if the bell were drawing its power from the very air itself. The space seemed to warp, the shadows deepening and twisting around them like tendrils, creeping toward them with a malevolent force. "Ilara, look!" Jasper shouted, his voice hoarse, pointing toward the back of the tower, where a faint glow had begun to seep through the cracks in the walls. It was a dull, sickly light, faint at first, but growing stronger with every passing second. The bells. Tolling seemed to increase in time with the growing light, as though the two were connected, bound in some unholy union. Ilara's eyes widened as she saw the shape taking form in the shadows. It was a figure, indistinct at first, but growing clearer by the second. It was tall, impossibly tall, with arms that reached down to the floor and a face that was an unholy amalgamation of twisted memories. Ilara recoiled, her breath catching in her throat as the figure took shape, its eyes hollow pits of darkness pulling at her very soul. That's not possible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure stepped forward, and with each movement, the bells' ringing grew louder, more forceful, more insistent. The presence was unmistakable. This was no mere ghost, no fleeting apparition. It was something ancient, something tied to the very fabric of the town, of the bell, and of her mother's past. "Ilara," Jasper said urgently, grabbing her by the shoulders, his voice trembling with fear. "This is it. This is what we've been searching for. It's the bell's keeper, the thing that was born from the bell's power." The figure before them seemed to pulse with energy, its form becoming more solid, more real with every passing second. Ilara could feel her knees weaken, her body trembling with fear. She had seen things in her life, strange things, supernatural things, but nothing like this. This was real. This was alive. "Ilara, listen to me," Jasper continued, his voice filled with desperation. "This is why your mother left. This is why she tried to keep you away from Bell Hollow. She knew what was coming. The bell is more than just a tool, it's a prison, a trap. And now it's calling you, pulling you back into its curse." Ilara shook her head, her heart pounding so loud she could barely hear his words. No, I don't understand. What do you mean? What's happening?" Jasper's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "The bell doesn't just ring to call the dead. It feeds off of the living, Ilara. It's an anchor for everything that has died in this town. It's the source of Bell Hollow's curse, and your mother. She tried to stop it. She couldn't. Now it's you it wants." Before Ilara could process his words, the figure in front of them lurched forward. Its eyes, dark, empty, infinite, locked onto her. The bell's tolling seemed to intensify, vibrating the very walls of the tower, as if the entire town were being pulled into the sound. "No!" Ilara screamed, instinctively backing away, but the figure continued to advance. Its presence filled the room, a suffocating darkness that consumed everything in its path. The bell tolled louder and louder, drowning out all other sounds until Ilara felt she was being swallowed by it. She turned to Jasper, her voice desperate. "What do we do? How do we stop it?" Jasper's eyes were filled with tears, his voice barely a whisper. "You can't stop it. You're part of it now. We all are." The figure loomed closer, its long arms reaching for her. The shadows began to close in around them, and Ilara felt the suffocating pressure of the bell's tolling, of its call wrapping around her, pulling her toward the edge of something she couldn't understand. The bell's power was too strong. There was no escaping it. But then, just as the figure's cold, twisted fingers brushed against her skin, a deep, final toll of the bell rang out, louder than anything she had ever heard. The air around her pulsed with energy, and for a split second everything went silent. The figure vanished, the shadows dissipating, leaving nothing but an emptiness that filled the room like a void. Ilara staggered back, gasping for air, her body trembling violently. The bell's tolling had stopped, but the silence it left behind was even more unsettling. It wasn't gone. It was waiting. "Jasper," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "What just happened? What did we do?" Jasper looked at her, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and terror. "The bell. It's begun. It's called you. It's called us. And now, there's no going back. The silence in the bell tower was suffocating, a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to stretch endlessly, like the town of Bell Hollow itself had stopped breathing. Ilara's body was numb, her mind spinning as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. The figure, the thing, had disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but the feeling of its presence, that suffocating, consuming darkness, remained. She could still feel the weight of its eyes on her, its cold fingers grazing her skin. The tolling of the bell had stopped, but the emptiness it left behind felt like a chasm, pulling at her soul. Jasper was standing beside her, breathing heavily, his face ashen, his eyes wide with a look of shock that mirrored her own. He couldn't seem to look away from the empty space where the figure had stood, his body frozen in place, as if the terror had paralyzed him. "Ilara," Jasper whispered hoarsely, his voice distant. "We're in deeper than we thought. That thing, it was bound to the bell. It was never going to let us go." Ilara nodded, her throat dry, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know if she should be relieved that the thing was gone or terrified that it might return. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear, confusion, and grief. There were too many questions, too many things she didn't understand. And yet, in the pit of her stomach, she knew that the answers she was searching for weren't in the tower. They weren't even in Bell Hollow anymore. They were buried in the past. "I can't..." Ilara's voice faltered as she took a step away from Jasper. "I can't stay here anymore. We need to leave this place. It's not safe." But Jasper didn't move. Instead, he seemed to grow more tense, more agitated. "Ilara, listen to me," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We can't leave. Not until we understand what's happening. The bell's curse, it's tied to everything. And your mother, she was at the heart of it." Ilara turned to him sharply, her confusion deepening. "What do you mean? What does my mother have to do with it?" Jasper didn't immediately answer. His eyes darted around the room as if he was looking for something. Then, with a heavy sigh, he stepped closer to the back wall of the tower, where a large wooden chest sat, half hidden in the corner. The chest was old, with ornate carvings etched into its surface, carvings that Ilara hadn't noticed before. She watched him closely, a gnawing sense of dread curling in her stomach. Without a word, Jasper approached the chest, his hands trembling as he reached for the brass latch. He hesitated, then opened it. Ilara's heart skipped a beat as he pulled out a leather-bound book, its pages worn and yellowed with age. It looked old, much older than anything she had seen before. She had no idea how it had ended up in the tower, hidden away like this. But there was something in the way Jasper's eyes lingered on it, something that made Ilara's blood run cold. "Jasper, what is that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He opened the book slowly, his fingers brushing the pages with a sense of reverence, as if he was afraid that the book itself might shatter under his touch. The pages were filled with symbols, drawings, and strange diagrams that Ilara couldn't understand. But at the center of the page, one word was repeated over and over: sacrifice. "This is your mother's journal," Jasper said quietly, looking up at Ilara with haunted eyes. She was involved in something more than just the bell. She was part of a ritual to bind the bell to Bell Hollow. She thought she could stop it, she thought she could silence it forever, but she made a mistake. Ilara took a shaky breath, her mind racing. Her mother had been involved in some kind of ritual. A sacrifice? Ilara had always known there were secrets buried in her family's past, but this was something she had never imagined. She thought she could seal it, Jasper continued, his voice thick with the weight of the truth he was revealing. But the bell, it's not just an object, it's a prison. It holds the souls of everyone who's died in this town, everyone who died because of the curse. Your mother was trying to contain it, to stop it from reaching you. She knew what was coming, Ilara. She knew the bell would eventually call you. Ilara stepped back, her mind reeling. This was too much. The bell, the curse, the sacrifice. It all felt like too much to bear. Her mother had known. She had known that Ilara would be drawn back to this place, that the bell would call to her, and yet she had never told her, never warned her. Why didn't she tell me? Ilara whispered, more to herself than to Jasper. Why didn't she warn me? Jasper closed the journal with a soft thud, his face clouded with sorrow. She tried, Ilara. She tried to protect you from it. But the bell's power is too strong. It's always been stronger than we realize. It calls, and we answer. And once you're caught in its grip, there's no escaping. Ilara's thoughts swirled, a storm of confusion and fear. She could feel the bell's presence now, stronger than ever before, pulsing in the very air around her. The tolling had stopped, but the echo of its sound was still in her mind, resonating deep within her bones. Ilara, Jasper said quietly, his voice laced with urgency. We need to go, now, before it gets worse. But Ilara didn't move. She couldn't. She had to know more. She had to understand what had happened, what her mother had done, and what was still waiting for her. The bell wasn't just a memory. It was a living thing, a force that would never stop calling. I'm not leaving, Ilara said, her voice firm, not until I understand everything. Jasper looked at her, his eyes filled with worry. Ilara, you don't understand. You don't know what's coming. The bell, it's not just a curse, it's an entity, a creature that feeds off our fear, our pain. It wants us all. And now it wants you. The journal, the ritual, the sacrifice. It all made sense now, at least in a twisted, terrifying way. Ilara could feel it deep in her chest, that pull. The bell was calling to her, not just as a relic of the past, but as a force that wanted to consume her, to claim her as its own. But she couldn't leave, not yet. She had to finish what her mother had started. She had to end this curse once and for all. The tolling of the bell began again, faint at first, but then louder, as if the bell were waking from a long, restless slumber. The air seemed to hum with its power, and Ilara felt a surge of fear rush through her. The bell was calling, and this time it wouldn't stop. The ringing. Ilara could hear it again, louder than before, ringing in her skull like a maddening, constant pulse. It wasn't just in her ears anymore. It was inside her, reverberating through her chest, through her bones, like her very body had become an instrument of the bell's terrible call. The sound of it felt suffocating, like it was pulling her deeper into Bell Hollow, deeper into the curse that had been set in motion long before her birth. Jasper stood next to her, his face drawn, his expression tight with fear. He had been trying to pull her away from the journal, from the revelations it contained, but Ilara wouldn't move. She couldn't. The pieces were starting to come together, like a shattered mirror being slowly pieced back into something whole. But the reflection it showed was terrifying. Her mother, the bell, the town's ancient history, all intertwined in a way she had never imagined. We need to go, Jasper said, his voice urgent, but Ilara could see the desperation in his eyes. He was afraid, and she couldn't blame him. They had opened the door to something that was never meant to be uncovered, something that should have remained buried. But Ilara shook her head. I can't. I have to finish this. I have to understand why my mother did this, why she tried to protect me by keeping it all hidden. I can't leave until I know everything. Jasper looked at her, his eyes flickering with doubt. He had never been as convinced as she was about her need to uncover the past. And now, seeing her standing in the bell tower, surrounded by the ghosts of Bell Hollow's history, he was starting to see the weight of what they were up against. He stepped closer, his voice low. You don't know what you're asking, Ilara. The bell doesn't care about your mother's intentions. It doesn't care about the past. It wants to consume everything. It will consume you. The warning in his voice sent a shiver down Ilara's spine, but her resolve hardened. She couldn't walk away from this. Not now. Not when she was so close to the truth. She needed to know what had happened to her mother. She needed to understand why the bell was still calling to her. I have to find her, Ilara said, her voice trembling but steady. My mother. I need to understand why she was involved in all of this. Jasper didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her, as if weighing his options, as if he was thinking of something else he hadn't told her yet. The silence between them was thick with unspoken fears, with the looming presence of the bell that pulsed in the air around them. It felt like the walls of the tower were closing in, suffocating them. Then, with a heavy sigh, Jasper spoke again. There's something you need to know, Ilara. Something I should have told you earlier, but I didn't. I couldn't. Ilara turned to him, her brow furrowing in confusion. What are you talking about? He hesitated, then took a step toward the wall, where a narrow door led to a hidden alcove. He reached for the doorknob and slowly opened it, revealing a small, cramped space filled with old, weathered furniture, boxes, and papers. It looked like another forgotten part of the church, a place that had been sealed off for years, untouched, buried in dust. This, Jasper said, his voice barely above a whisper, is where your mother did the ritual. The one to bind the bell. This is where it all started. Ilara stepped into the alcove, her pulse quickening as she took in the room. There were faded candles arranged in a circle on the floor, remnants of old rituals, strange symbols, markings. On the walls, and a large wooden chest sitting in the corner, locked with an intricate iron clasp. The air in the room was dense with something ancient, something dark, like it had absorbed the power of the bell over the years. Jasper moved to the chest, his hands shaking as he unlocked it, revealing a collection of old, brittle pages and worn, leather-bound books. Ilara's heart thudded in her chest. She knew what these were. They were more of her mother's journals, more of the history she had hidden from her. Jasper pulled out a thick, aged book, its cover darkened by years of neglect. He opened it carefully, his fingers tracing the lines of text as he scanned the pages. Your mother didn't just try to stop the bell. She tried to bind it, Ilara, to lock it away forever, but she couldn't. Not entirely. Ilara stepped forward, her mind racing with the implications of what he was saying. What do you mean she couldn't? What happened? Jasper paused, looking up at her with a look of fear in his eyes. She made a deal. She thought she could use the bell's power to trap it, to control it. But she didn't realize that. It wasn't just an object, it was a force, a living entity that feeds off death. And once you've made a deal with it, there's no escaping. Your mother thought she could keep it contained, but it's always been here, in Bell Hollow. It's tied to this place. He flipped through the pages, stopping on one that was covered in strange, arcane symbols. This, he said, pointing to the page, was the ritual she used. She tried to bind the bell, but the price was too high. The bell demands a life, a sacrifice, and when she couldn't give it, she tried to bury the knowledge, tried to erase the ritual. But the bell, it remembers. Ilara felt a chill run through her, her breath catching in her throat. Her mother had made a deal with the bell, and then, when she couldn't complete the ritual, had she sacrificed herself? Or worse, had she tried to sacrifice Ilara? Did she do it? Ilara asked, her voice trembling. Did she sacrifice someone? Jasper's expression darkened. I don't think she ever got the chance, but the bell doesn't need a willing sacrifice. It takes what it needs. And now, Ilara, you're the one it's calling. Ilara felt the weight of his words sink deep into her chest, like a stone dropped into a well. She had thought she was here to uncover the truth, to understand the bell's history, to understand her mother, but now it felt like the truth was something darker, something more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She stepped back, her hand clutching the journal to her chest, and looked around the small, claustrophobic space. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air thick with the heavy weight of the bell's curse. She could still hear the faint ringing, its tone reverberating in the back of her mind, and she knew that the bell wasn't finished with her. Not yet, not until it had taken everything. Ilara. Jasper's voice was strained, full of fear. We need to leave this place. The bell, it's only going to get stronger. It's already taken so much. You don't want to be the one to finish what your mother started. But Ilara could hear the bell calling, louder now, more insistent. The shadows seemed to stretch toward her, pulling her deeper into the dark history of Bell Hollow. She couldn't run, not now. She had to face it. She had to finish what her mother had started, whether she was ready or not. The air in the alcove felt heavier now, thick with something ancient and dark that clung to the walls, to the books, to the very air they breathed. Ilara couldn't shake the sense that she was standing on the precipice of something far worse than she had ever imagined. Every moment seemed to stretch longer, weighed down by the knowledge that she was getting closer to something her mother had tried to keep hidden, something that had bound itself to the very essence of Bell Hollow. Jasper's face had turned a ghostly pale as he stood next to her, his hands trembling slightly as he held the open journal. Ilara, you need to understand. The bell. It's not just calling you, it's trying to consume you, he said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and sorrow. Your mother knew what was coming, but she thought that if she could contain it, you'd be safe. But she was wrong. Ilara felt a chill run through her, her thoughts muddled. Consume me? It had felt like something was inside her, pressing against her chest like an invisible weight, tugging at her very soul. She couldn't ignore it anymore. The bell's pull was growing stronger, louder, the tolling filling the air like a constant, insistent thrum in the back of her mind. And it wasn't just the sound of it. No, it felt like something was pulling at her from the inside, a gnawing sensation deep in her chest, reaching toward her heart. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to center herself, but the ringing only grew louder, like it was all-encompassing, consuming everything around her. The walls of the alcove seemed to shift, their angles becoming wrong, their edges distorting. She opened her eyes, and the world before her blurred into a swirl of blackness and light, like a storm was closing in. Ilara. Jasper's voice seemed distant, muffled by the ringing, though she could still feel his hand on her arm. His voice was a lifeline, but it felt like it was being swallowed by something larger. We need to leave. We need to get out of here before it's too late. But Ilara couldn't move. The pull of the bell had changed. It wasn't just in the sound anymore. It was in the very air, in the shadows that seemed to stretch longer and deeper into the alcove. It felt like the walls themselves were breathing, exhaling something dark and cold. Don't go, she thought. It's all here. I need to know more. I have to understand. Suddenly the room seemed to darken, the shadows twisting unnaturally. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift, and the edges of the alcove started to dissolve, as if the very space around her was warping into something else. Ilara's head spun, and she felt herself falling, the ground slipping away from beneath her. She reached out instinctively, but there was nothing to grab onto, nothing to steady her. A sharp breath escaped her lips as she realized the truth. She was crossing over. The sound of the bell rang louder in her mind, a deafening crash of metal against stone, and in the blink of an eye, she was no longer standing in the alcove. The walls of the church had vanished, replaced by an oppressive darkness. The air felt cold, colder than anything she had ever experienced. She couldn't see her own hands in front of her face, but she could feel something around her, something watching, something waiting. And then she heard it. A voice. Ilara. Her name, whispered from somewhere deep within the dark, as if it was coming from all around her, wrapping itself around her thoughts. She froze, her body stiffening with fear. The voice was so familiar, but distorted, hollow, as if it was being pulled through an impossible distance, stretched thin by time and space. Ilara. The voice again, closer this time, and it was unmistakable. Her mother. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The darkness before her shifted, forming into a figure. The outline was blurred at first, like smoke taking shape, but then it solidified. The figure was tall, twisted, its body shrouded in shadow. She could make out the features of a woman, her mother, but something was wrong. The figure's face was pale, too pale, and her eyes were sunken, hollow like dark pits, empty of life. Ilara's heart clenched in her chest. "Mom, is it really you?" Ilara's voice trembled as she stepped closer to the apparition. Her mind screamed to turn away, but she couldn't. She was drawn to her mother's face, even though something in the pit of her stomach screamed that this wasn't truly her mother. The figure's lips parted, and Ilara could feel her mother's breath, cold and hollow, reach her skin. "You're not meant to be here," the voice rasped, filled with an unnatural echo. "This is not your place, Ilara. This place is cursed." The darkness around them seemed to pulse, like it was alive, tightening with each word. The tolling of the bell filled her ears, louder now, almost deafening. It was as if the entire world was reverberating with the bell's sound. "I know," Ilara said, her voice cracking. "I know this place is cursed, but I need to know. Why did you do it, Mum? Why didn't you tell me?" The figure's expression twisted, and the darkness around it began to swirl, the shadows growing longer and deeper, reaching toward Ilara like tendrils. "I tried to protect you," the voice whispered. "I tried to keep you safe from it. From the bell. But you've already heard it. You've already answered its call." "No," Ilara said, shaking her head. "I don't understand. You wanted to protect me. Why did you make the deal? Why did you involve yourself with the bell in the first place?" The figure stepped forward, its body still shifting unnaturally in the darkness, its movements jerky and disjointed. "I didn't make a deal. I was the deal. I was the one who kept it locked away, contained. But it's always been here. Always. And now..." The figure's voice faltered, as if it was struggling to speak. "Now it's too late. The bell is waking, Ilara. It's calling to you. You're the one it needs." Ilara's chest tightened as the bell's tolling grew louder, more urgent. Her hands were shaking, but she reached out toward the apparition. "Please tell me how to stop it. Tell me how to break the curse, to end it once and for all." But the figure only smiled, if it could be called a smile, and its face twisted, the edges blurring as the shadows wrapped around it, suffocating. The image of her mother. "It's too late for that," the voice whispered. "The bell has chosen you." And then, in a violent rush, the darkness erupted, the tolling of the bell reaching a crescendo. Ilara felt herself falling, tumbling through the shadows, her body weightless, the voice of her mother fading as she was swallowed by the dark. She cried out, her hands reaching out into the emptiness, but there was nothing to hold on to. The bell's tolling echoed through her mind, as if the very sound was tearing at the fabric of her thoughts. And then the silence came, a silence so profound, so complete, that it crushed her entire being. She was alone. She had crossed the threshold into something far worse than she had ever imagined. The silence was suffocating, Ilara stood in the void, her chest heaving with each shallow breath. The world around her nothing but an endless, oppressive blackness. The bell's tolling had stopped, but its resonance lingered in the air, vibrating through her skull. The voice of her mother, that distorted echo, still echoed in her mind, looping over and over like a broken record. The words had been clear, chilling in their finality. The bell has chosen you. Her fingers trembled as they reached out into the dark. There was nothing to grasp, no solid ground beneath her feet, just emptiness. The feeling of being lost was overwhelming, a sensation she had never experienced before. It wasn't just physical disorientation, it was as if her very mind was unraveling. Each thought splintering, fragmenting, like pieces of shattered glass. She couldn't tell if she was still in the bell tower, or if she had crossed into some twisted version of reality where nothing was certain. Ilara, her name again. The whisper was faint, distant, but it cut through the void, clear as day. She froze, her heart skipping a beat, the sound pulling her back into awareness. The voice was so familiar. She had heard it before, earlier in the tower, when she had seen the distorted figure of her mother. But this time, it wasn't her mother's voice. It was something else, something darker. Ilara. This time, it was more insistent. The voice was closer, coming from somewhere within the void. Ilara turned her head, trying to find its source. But the darkness was all-encompassing. Her heart pounded louder, and a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that there was something or someone watching her. Her pulse quickened, the ringing in her ears growing louder, again pulling her deeper into the illusion. Suddenly a shape materialized in the blackness, faint at first, then clearer. It was a figure, its features indistinct, shrouded in shadow, like a person wrapped in darkness. It moved toward her, slowly at first, then faster, until it was right in front of her. Ilara. The figure spoke her name again, but this time, the voice was unmistakable. It was her own voice, warped, twisted, like a reflection of herself turned into something grotesque. "No," she whispered, her throat dry. "No, I'm not. I'm not you." But the figure didn't speak. Instead, it raised a hand, her hand, and reached toward her, fingers stretching out with unnatural precision, like a shadow trying to take form, trying to claim her. Ilara stumbled back, her feet tripping over nothing, as though the ground itself had shifted beneath her. She gasped for air, but it felt like the very atmosphere was pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. "Stop!" Ilara cried, but her voice was drowned out by the tolling of the bell, which had returned, now deafening. The sound grew louder, until it felt like it was shaking her bones, rattling her thoughts. The figure's hand inched closer, its fingers now just inches away from her face. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were black pits, empty voids that threatened to consume her. Ilara, her name again, but it wasn't just the figure now. The bell had woven itself into the very fabric of her consciousness. She felt its presence in the very core of her being, like an unholy pulse that echoed in her chest with every beat of her heart. She could feel it. It was her. She was the bell now. "Please," she gasped, her mind fracturing under the weight of the realization. I can't. The figure smirked, its lips twisting into something that was almost a grin, but not quite. The darkness around her thickened, suffocating her in its grip, until it felt like she was drowning in it. "Ilara, don't. You see?" The voice of the figure, now clearly her own voice, rang out once more, louder, more distorted. "The bell has already chosen you. You're part of it. You always have been." "No!" Ilara whispered, shaking her head violently, her hands rising to her ears, trying to block out the sound of her own voice. I'm not the bell. I can't be. but the figure only smiled. The empty pits where its eyes should have been glimmering with something malevolent. You were always meant to be. You were born into this town, Ilara. The bell has always been waiting for you. It calls to you. It calls to all of us. But you... The figure leaned closer. Its voice turning into a hiss. You can't escape it, not anymore. The darkness around her closed in tighter. The bell's toll now pounding in her ears like a thunderstorm, a violent, unstoppable force. Her breath came faster, her chest tight with panic, as if the air itself was being sucked away. The walls of the darkness were closing in. The ringing was inside her head, outside, everywhere, all-encompassing. There was no escape. Ilara, you're part of it, and it's part of you. Suddenly, the tolling stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, louder than the ringing had ever been. Ilara blinked, her mind reeling, and when she opened, her eyes... The figure was gone. The darkness was still there, but it seemed to shift, to change, dissipating, evaporating into the ether. But the ringing still echoed in her mind. It was louder now, more persistent. The figure, her shadow, was gone, but the bell was still there, still in her head, still pulling at her from the inside. She was no longer in the void. The world around her had changed, but she couldn't tell where she was. The walls, the air, the very space, it all felt like it was shifting, twisting. She could hear the soft rustle of something, papers, footsteps. She turned, her head spinning, and found herself standing in the hallway of the old church. The bells had stopped ringing, but the weight of the air around her pressed against her like a physical force. Ilara, a voice called out, and she turned sharply, her heart nearly leaping from her chest. It was Jasper. He was standing in the doorway, his face filled with concern, his eyes wide. Ilara, he repeated, stepping toward her. You were gone for so long. Ilara blinked, her thoughts still scattered, trying to piece together what had just happened. The void, the figure, the tolling. It all felt so real. But she was here now, in the church. Was it a dream? A hallucination? Ilara swallowed, her throat dry as her mind struggled to catch up. I don't know what just happened. It was like I was... She stopped, shaking her head. It was real, Jasper. I felt it. I heard it. Jasper's face softened, but the concern in his eyes didn't fade. We need to get out of here, Ilara. You're not safe here. The bell, it's too powerful. It's already taken hold of you. Ilara stared at him, her chest tight with unease. Was she truly free of it? Could she escape it now? Or was she too now part of the curse? Her mind cracked with the weight of it all, and the tolling of the bell began again, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. Ilara stood in the church, the distant toll of the bell still reverberating in her skull. The sound was louder now, impossibly loud, and yet it was as if it wasn't coming from the tower anymore. It was coming from inside her, from the very core of her being. The ringing filled her mind, twisting her thoughts, drowning out everything else. It was a constant hum in the background of her senses, a haunting reminder that she was never truly alone. The bell had already found her. Jasper's voice cut through the fog of her mind. Ilara, he said, his tone laced with fear and urgency. You need to listen to me. The bell, it's not just calling you anymore, it's claiming you. She snapped her head toward him, struggling to focus. His face was pale, his eyes wide with worry. She could see the desperation in his gaze, but she couldn't make sense of anything. The words he spoke seemed like they were coming from far. Away, distant and muffled, swallowed by the tolling, by the echo of the bell that pulsed through her veins. Jasper. I don't. Ilara's voice trailed off as her head began to swim again, the dizziness overwhelming her. I can't escape it. It's inside me. I feel it. Jasper reached for her, but there was a hesitation in his touch. I know. I know, but you're still here, Ilara. You can fight it. I believe you can. But Ilara wasn't sure anymore. She wasn't sure what was real or what was part of the curse that had gripped her, that had reached its icy fingers into her very soul. The bell was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, an entity that hovered over her, suffocating her with its influence. And now, it was speaking to her, louder than ever. Ilara. The voice was soft, almost tender, but it sent a wave of icy fear through her body. It was her mother's voice, but distorted, like a reflection warped in a cracked mirror. Ilara spun around, her heart hammering in her chest, searching for the source of the voice. But there was no one there. Only the endless darkness of the church's vast interior, the shadows stretching long and endless. Ilara, it's time. Time. The word echoed in her mind, and suddenly the tolling of the bell grew sharper, more defined, like it was piercing the very fabric of her consciousness. It was as if the bell was speaking through her mother's voice, pulling at her, trying to reach her. Her mother had tried to protect her. Ilara remembered the journals, the rituals her mother had performed, the sacrifices she had made, everything her mother had done to keep her safe, to keep the bell from taking her. But it hadn't worked. The bell had always been there, waiting, calling. Now it had claimed her. She could feel it, inside her, part of her, entwined with her very being. Ilara. The voice whispered again, now soft, almost coaxing. You've already answered. You've already made the choice. Ilara closed her eyes, trying to block out the voice, the tolling, but it was impossible. She could feel her mind unraveling, the edges of her reality blurring. The bell wasn't just a curse anymore, it was a calling, a summoning. The bell was alive, and she was its anchor, its vessel. Please, Ilara whispered, the tears welling up in her eyes. I don't want this. I don't want to be part of it. Jasper reached out to her, his hands shaking as he grasped her shoulders, trying to steady her. Ilara, listen to me. You're not alone in this. I won't let it take you. We can fight it together. But Ilara could already feel the truth creeping in, a truth she hadn't been willing to admit until now. The bell was stronger than anything she could fight. It had already claimed her. It had been waiting for her all along, patiently, silently, like a predator in the shadows. It had already chosen her. I'm sorry, she said, her voice trembling. She turned away from Jasper, her steps slow, as though her body was moving of its own accord. I don't know if I can fight it anymore. Jasper tried to grab her again, to stop her, but she brushed him off, a wave of cold dread washing over her as she stepped toward the open door of the church. The bell's tolling had grown louder, more intense, and now it felt like it was coming from every direction, pressing in on her, pulling her toward it. Ilara, Jasper shouted, his voice hoarse with panic, but she didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind was no longer her own. The bell's pull had taken over, and she was walking toward it, toward the thing that had been calling her for so long. Outside, the town of Bell Hollow stood silent in the fog, the streets empty and desolate, as though the very life had been drained from the place. The bell tower loomed in the distance, the silhouette of its broken structure standing against the sky, a monument to the curse that had hung over this town for generations. Ilara felt herself drawn toward it, as though it were the only thing left in the world. The ringing filled her ears, louder now, relentless. Each step she took felt heavier, as though the ground beneath her was sinking into the earth, pulling her deeper. She stumbled, her breath coming in short gasps, but she couldn't stop. She had to get to the bell. She had to answer its call. Ilara, the voice came again, more insistent now, more familiar. It was her mother, but it wasn't. She could feel it, deep in her chest, the presence of her mother trapped within the bell, calling her back to the place where it had all begun. She reached the base of the bell tower and looked up. The structure loomed over her, its broken frame casting long shadows across the ground. The bell had been gone for years, but she could feel it there, pulsing in the air, a phantom presence that filled the space around her. The tolling had stopped. The silence was overwhelming. Ilara, her mother's voice whispered one final time, soft and distant. It's time to join us. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and for a split second, the bell tower seemed to come alive, shifting and groaning as if it were awakening from a long slumber. Ilara could feel the energy in the air, a surge of power that made her knees weaken. It was drawing her in. The bell was calling her, and this time there would be no escape. As the fog thickened around her, the world seemed to fade. Ilara's body felt light, like she was floating, her feet no longer touching the ground. The tolling had stopped, but the sound of the bell remained in her mind, a constant hum, a warning and a welcome. She had answered the call, and now the bell would claim her forever. The fog was thicker than ever, clinging to Ilara's skin like cold fingers. It wrapped around her, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of her. Each breath felt heavier, as if the very air was thick with the weight of the curse that had taken hold of Bell Hollow. She had crossed the threshold. She had followed the bell's call, and now she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't fully comprehend. The bell tower loomed before her, its silhouette dark against the pale sky. It had been silent for so long, but Ilara could still feel the hum, the vibration deep in her bones, as if the tower itself was breathing, waiting for something. The bell had never truly been gone. It had always been a part of Bell Hollow, a malignant force that had wrapped its fingers around this town, around her for generations. Her body moved on its own, drawn to the base of the bell tower as though she were nothing more than a puppet. She couldn't stop it, couldn't pull herself away, no matter how much her mind screamed at her to run. The bell had chosen her, just as it had chosen so many others before her. It had been waiting patiently for her to finally arrive. Ilara, the voice came again, clearer now, and she shivered at the sound of her own name. But it wasn't just a voice. It was a presence. Something cold, something ancient, was reaching out to her, calling her into the depths of the tower. The tolling had stopped, but she could feel the echo in her chest, a rhythmic thumping that matched her heartbeat. With each step, the ground beneath her feet seemed to sink deeper, as if the earth itself was opening up beneath her, pulling her down. The tower appeared to stretch upward, higher than it had any right to be, the walls twisting and bending in on themselves as though they were alive. The darkness around her deepened, and the shadows seemed to writhe, twisting into forms that weren't quite human but not quite monstrous either. They were shapes made of darkness, of memory and fear. The air grew colder as she reached the entrance of the tower, her breath misting in front of her like smoke. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she stepped inside, her feet sinking into the dust-covered floor with each movement. The walls were coated in a thick layer of grime, the remnants of the years of neglect the tower had endured since the bell had been removed. Yet even with all the decay, the sense of something alive inside the tower was overwhelming. Ilara could feel it in the very air around her, the presence of something older than the town, older than her, something that had been waiting for the right moment to awaken. Ilara. The voice was louder now, almost a whisper directly in her ear, sending a chill through her spine. She turned sharply, but no one was there. The tower was empty, silent, except for the distant whispering that seemed to echo off the walls like the murmurs of 1,000 lost souls. The tolling of the bell began again. This time it was not distant or muffled. It was right here, inside the tower, inside her mind. It was impossible to tell if the sound was real or if it was just a figment of her imagination. But it didn't matter. The bell was here, and it was speaking to her, drawing her deeper. Her feet moved on their own, pushing her forward toward the center of the tower. It was there that she saw it, a large stone pedestal, its surface covered in dust and decay. On the pedestal rested an object, something that had been hidden for so long, and yet Alara knew, deep down, that this was it, the heart of the curse. The bell. It sat there, tarnished and worn, its once pristine surface now a mass of cracks and fissures. But even in its dilapidated state, it seemed to pulse with a terrible energy, like a heart that had been long dead but was somehow still beating. The sound of its tolling had become deafening, vibrating through the very foundation of the tower. Alara could feel it in her chest, like the bell was inside her, taking root in her soul. She stepped closer, drawn to it, unable to stop herself. The bell had been silent for so long, but it was never really gone. The curse had never left. It had only been waiting for someone to come back, for someone to answer its call. Alara. This time the voice was no longer just a whisper. It was her mother's voice, clear and strong, coming from the bell itself, echoing through the chamber. Alara, you've come home. You've answered the call. Ilara's heart skipped a beat, and her breath caught in her throat. Mum? Is that really you? The bell vibrated violently, its tolling louder than ever. The shadows in the room shifted, swirling in on themselves, as though something was moving through the air, something unseen, something ancient and malevolent. Alara reached out instinctively, her fingers trembling as she touched the surface of the bell. It was cold, so cold. As her fingers made contact with the bell, the room around her seemed to shift, distort. The air grew thick, pressing in on her from all sides. The bell's tolling grew louder until it felt like it was pounding inside her skull, shaking her bones. Alara. Her mother's voice echoed again, more distorted this time, as though the bell was speaking through her. I did what I could to protect you. I tried to keep you safe, but it was too late. The bell. It's part of you now. You can never escape. Alara's breath caught in her throat, her head spinning. The tolling of the bell became a cacophony, a chorus of voices that seemed to chant her name, beckoning her into the depths. The shadows around her began to twist and writhe like serpents, reaching toward her, closing in. No, Alara gasped, stepping back, shaking her head. I can't. I don't want this. I don't want any of this. But the bell's tolling grew louder, the shadows pressing in tighter. The walls of the tower began to dissolve, as if the very structure was falling apart, consumed by the darkness. Alara reached for the walls, trying to steady herself, but they dissolved into nothingness, leaving her suspended in a black void. The bell's tolling surged again, now a violent, deafening roar. It felt like it was consuming everything. Her mind, her body, her soul. The darkness swallowed her, and for a moment she lost all sense of time, of space. And then, just as suddenly, the bell went silent. The oppressive weight of the darkness lifted. Alara opened her eyes, blinking against the sudden stillness. She was no longer in the tower. The fog had lifted, and the bell's tolling had ceased. For the first time, she could hear her own breath, her heart beating in her chest, but everything else felt wrong. The world around her had shifted. The bell was silent, but the curse remained. Alara's legs trembled beneath her as the world around her twisted, as though the very fabric of reality was bending and breaking. The darkness that had filled the tower seemed to cling to her skin, to her soul, like a shadow that refused to let go. For a moment, she felt weightless, as though she was suspended in a place that existed outside of time, caught between the past and the present, between the bell's call and the fragments of her mother's voice. But then, just as quickly as it had come, the silence returned. The tolling of the bell had ceased, and for the first time, Ilara was left with only the faint echo of its presence, reverberating in the very core of her being. It was a quiet hum now, distant, but undeniably there, like a whisper that would never fade. She took a slow, shaky step forward, her feet finding the ground beneath her, but the air felt thick, oppressive. It pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe, like something was weighing her down, something more than just the curse of the bell. It was as if the very weight of her mother's choices, her mother's sins, was pressing on her shoulders. Her chest ached with the burden of it all. Ilara. The voice was unmistakable. Her voice. Her mother's voice, soft and distant, came from somewhere behind her, like a whisper on the wind. Ilara froze, her heart clenching in her chest. The tolling of the bell began again, faint at first, but building, getting louder, and with it, the shadows around her seemed to deepen, stretching out toward her as if the very air was reaching. For her, Ilara, the voice said again, clearer now, but filled with an unsettling echo. You've come far, too far. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. But there was no one there, just the shadows, the thick fog swirling in the distance, and the distant silhouette of the bell tower behind her. The air felt heavy with something ancient, something that had been buried long ago. It was as if her mother's spirit, her presence, was wrapped around the bell, bound to it forever. And now, that presence was reaching out to her. Ilara took a step back, her hands trembling at her sides. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Where are you? Please, tell me what's happening." But the silence answered her. There was no response. The world around her remained still, save for the swirling fog and the ever-present toll of the bell, which seemed to be pulling at her, drawing her in. It was a steady, rhythmic sound, like the heartbeat of the town itself, pulsing in the background. Unyielding, demanding attention. "Ilara, you must understand." The voice came again, this time more urgent, more forceful, filling the space around her. "You can't escape it. You never could." Her mother's voice, clear and cold now, echoed in her mind. The words twisted around her thoughts like a serpent coiling tighter, tightening its grip. Ilara clenched her fists at her sides, her breath shallow. The weight of the curse, the burden of her mother's sins, was becoming too much. She had thought she was close to finding peace, to finding the truth. But now she realized the truth wasn't something that could be found. It was something that consumed. "You knew the bell was cursed, didn't you?" Ilara said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and frustration. "You knew it would come to this. You knew it would take me." The shadows around her seemed to shift, as if responding to her words. The air grew colder, the fog thickening, and then, as if from nowhere, a figure appeared in the distance, emerging from the swirling darkness. The figure was tall, draped in shadows, its features obscured, but Ilara could feel its presence, feel the weight of it bearing down on her. "Ilara, you don't understand," the voice whispered again, this time coming from the figure, the form now taking shape in front of her. It was like a shadow made flesh, twisted and distorted, but she recognized it. She recognized the face, her own face. The figure's eyes were hollow, empty voids. Its lips were twisted into a smirk that was more cruel than comforting. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth, like a ghost gliding across the ground. "No, this isn't possible," Ilara gasped, taking a step back. You're me." The figure tilted its head, its smile growing wider, more unsettling. "I am you." "But not really," it said, its voice echoing in her mind. I am the part of you that the bell has claimed. The part of you that has always been bound to it. Ilara's heart skipped a beat, her thoughts scattering. She could feel the pull of the figure, the magnetism of its presence drawing her closer, wrapping itself around her like chains. No, she whispered, shaking her head, her breath ragged. I don't belong to the bell. I don't belong to this. The figure laughed, its voice a harsh, distorted echo of her own. You've always belonged, Ilara. From the moment you were born into Bell Hollow, you were tied to it. The bell, the curse, your mother, everything you are, everything you'll become. It's all part of the same story. The ground beneath her shifted, and Ilara felt the dizziness return. The bell's tolling filled her mind again, deafening, almost overwhelming. The figure's presence, her own twisted reflection, loomed closer. You think you can escape it? You think you can break free? The figure sneered, stepping closer. You can't. The bell is inside you now, and it's never going away. Ilara staggered back, her hands gripping her head as the tolling intensified, reverberating through her entire body. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. It was as though the bell itself was clawing at her insides, scratching at her thoughts, trying to pull her apart. It was too much. Please, she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible. Please, stop. But the figure only smirked, its hollow eyes gazing deep into her soul. There's no stopping it, not now. You belong to the bell, just like your mother did, just like everyone before you. With a final, chilling laugh, the figure began to dissolve into the shadows, vanishing into the fog. Ilara collapsed to her knees, her head spinning, her body trembling as the tolling of the bell continued to fill her mind, louder than ever before. And then, in the deafening silence that followed, she understood. The bell wasn't just a curse. It was a prison, a trap, and she had stepped into it willingly. Her mother had tried to stop it. But now, Ilara realized, she had become part of it. The air around Ilara was thick, pressing in on her like an invisible weight, suffocating her in its oppressive grip. The tolling of the bell still reverberated through her skull, a constant pulse, a rhythmic beat that matched her heart. It filled the spaces between her thoughts, drowning them out, twisting them into a single, relentless mantra. You belong to the bell. The words, the realization, echoed in her mind as she sat there in the swirling fog, her body frozen in place. She was numb. Numb to the cold that clung to her skin, numb to the dizziness that had once overwhelmed her. Everything was a blur now, like she was standing in the middle of a dream, a nightmare perhaps. The lines between what was real and what wasn't had begun to fade, and Ilara couldn't tell where the bell ended and she began. The shadows around her twisted like living things stretching out toward her, their edges jagged and dark. It was as if the world itself was being consumed, devoured by the very curse she had tried so desperately to escape. The bell had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many others before her, and now there was no going back. Ilara. The voice came again, not from any one direction, but from everywhere. It filled her mind, sinking into her consciousness like a weight. Her mother's voice, but distorted, the words hollow and distant. There was no comfort in it now, only a reminder of the price that had been paid, the price that Ilara had no choice but to pay as well. Ilara, you can't escape it, the voice whispered. You never could. The fog around her grew thicker, closing in like a suffocating veil. She stood shakily, her legs trembling beneath her, and turned in every direction, her eyes scanning the empty space. She was alone. Or was she? The bell's tolling grew louder, almost deafening. It was no longer a distant sound, something she could ignore. Now it was inside her head, shaking her thoughts, rattling her very bones. It was as though the bell was calling to her from the deepest part of her soul, pulling her deeper into the curse. The weight of it was too much to bear. Ilara. The voice again, closer this time, and in that moment, she realized it was no longer just her mother's voice. There was something else in it, something darker, something that made her heart race with panic. The tolling had stopped, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying. The stillness around her felt like a trap, and she could feel the walls closing in, the shadows creeping in from all sides, as if they were waiting for her to make a move. The ground beneath her feet shifted. She stumbled, her body faltering, but she caught herself against the cold stone walls. The tower. No, it wasn't just a tower. It was a place that had been twisted by the curse, by the bell. It was no longer a structure of stone and mortar. It was alive, breathing, suffocating her with its presence. Ilara. This time, the voice wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, filled with an unnatural force that shook her to the core. Her legs refused to move, her body locked in place, as though something, some force, was holding her there, keeping her from escaping. And then, through the thick fog, she saw it. The bell. It was not just an object sitting idly in the center of the room. It was alive, pulsing with energy, with a terrible power that radiated from its tarnished surface. The bell was bigger now, its form distorted, as though it was expanding, stretching to fill the room, the very air around her. The sound that had been pulsing in her head seemed to emanate from the bell itself now, its tolling deep and resonant, like the very heartbeat of Bell Hollow. Ilara took a step forward, and the bell tolled again, louder this time, shaking the room, rattling her mind. She could feel it. The bell was calling to her, pulling her closer, forcing her to step into its circle. It was like gravity, an inescapable force, pulling her toward it, closer and closer, until she could feel its presence, pressing against her skin. Ilara, you must understand. The voice came again, this time unmistakably her mother's. It was colder now, distant, filled with the hollow echo of a truth that had been buried too long. This is your destiny. You have always been bound to the bell. The curse runs through your veins. You can't fight it anymore. No, Ilara whispered, shaking her head, her body trembling with the weight of the words. I can't be a part of it. I won't let it consume me. But the bell tolled. Again, its sound growing louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was vibrating the very air around her. She was close now, close enough to touch it. Her hand reached out, trembling, and as her fingers brushed the cold, tarnished surface, a shock ran through her, a surge of energy so strong it knocked the breath from her lungs. The shadows around her surged forward, wrapping around her limbs, pulling her closer, until her body was pressed against the bell. She could feel the weight of it, the weight of her mother's sin, of the town's curse, of the centuries of pain and death that had been tied to the bell. You are the last, the voice whispered in her ear. The last to answer the call. The bell has waited for you. Ilara's heart raced as the tolling of the bell became a deafening roar, drowning out all other sounds, until it felt like her body was vibrating with the force of it. The bell had claimed her. It had always been waiting for her. And now there was no escape. Ilara, no. The voice faltered, the tone of desperation now unmistakable. But Ilara didn't listen. She couldn't. The bell had already claimed her. And with it, everything she had ever known was slipping away. Her mother's final words echoed in her mind, and with them, the toll of the bell reached its crescendo, a deafening final roar that shattered everything. And then there was silence. Ilara stood there, the weight of the bell pressing against her, the fog swirling around her like a living thing, and she understood. The bell was not just a symbol of the past, it was the future, and she was part of it. Still here? Brave. Or maybe you just like the feeling of being watched. Like, subscribe, and drop your time and location in the comments, so we know who's still out there. Now breathe slow, the worst is coming. The silence after the bell's final toll was suffocating. Ilara's breath came in shallow gasps, the cold stone of the bell's surface pressing against her palms as she steadied herself. The fog had grown heavier, swirling around her in a dark, oppressive mass, as if the air itself had turned to ink. She could feel the pulse of the bell deep in her chest, vibrating through her ribs, her heart, her very soul. For a long moment, everything was still. The bell tower seemed to hold its breath, as if it too was waiting for something, waiting for her to move, to make her choice. But Ilara didn't know what to do. She was trapped in a nightmare that had no escape, a nightmare that had been set into motion long before she was born. Her mother's voice still echoed in her mind, distant and cold. Ilara, you must understand. You can't escape it. The tolling had stopped, but the presence of the bell was still there, pressing against her from all sides. She felt the weight of it, the weight of everything her mother had tried to protect her from, the weight of the curse that had bound them both to this place. The bell was more than just an object. It was a force, an entity, a creature that fed on death, on pain, on fear. And now it had claimed her. Ilara, the voice came again, softer now, almost tender, but still filled with that same insistent pull. Her mother's voice. It was close, so close. The fog thickened, curling around her like a living thing. And for a moment, Ilara thought she saw a figure in the mist, standing just beyond the reach of her vision. But when she blinked, it was gone. Her pulse quickened. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something that had been watching her since she stepped foot in Bell Hollow. The shadows in the tower flickered, twisted, like they were alive, like they were waiting for her to make the next move. Ilara, the voice again, clear now, resonating deep in her mind, pulling at her, beckoning her forward. With trembling hands, Ilara reached for the bell once more, her fingers brushing the surface of the cold metal. The moment she touched it, a surge of energy rushed through her, a violent shock that seemed to split her vision in two. Her body jolted and the world around her spun, the darkness swallowing her whole. And then, everything went black. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. No sound, no light, no air. Only darkness. The kind of darkness that seeped into your bones and erased everything. Your memories, your thoughts, your very existence. Ilara could feel herself drifting, her mind slipping through the cracks, as if the bell had taken her somewhere else, somewhere beyond the reach of time and space. But then, through the silence, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing through the void. They grew louder, closer, until Ilara could hear them in the very center of her chest. The bell's pulse had returned, its tolling now a constant rhythm, beating like a heart in the darkness. Ilara, the voice again, but now it was different. It wasn't just her mother's voice, it was something else, something darker, something older. She opened her eyes, but there was nothing. No light, no shapes, only the thick fog pressing in on all sides. She tried to move, but her body felt heavy, as if she were trapped in a nightmare, unable to break free. She couldn't breathe. The fog seemed to fill her lungs, suffocating her. Ilara, the voice again, closer now, behind her. It sounded like her mother, but distorted, warped, as if it was being pulled through an endless void. With trembling hands, Ilara reached out into the fog, her fingers brushing against something cold, something hard, the surface of the bell. "No," Ilara whispered, her voice hoarse with fear. "No, no, no." But it was too late. The bell tolled again, louder this time, its sound vibrating through the very core of her being. The darkness began to shift, pulling her toward the sound, pulling her into its grasp. The fog receded, and Ilara found herself standing in the heart of the bell tower, the bell towering above her, its surface glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. The air around her was thick with an unnatural energy, crackling with power. She could feel it, the force of the bell reaching out to her, drawing her in. The tolling was deafening now, filling the entire space, reverberating through her chest, through her mind. The very walls of the tower seemed to pulse with the sound, like the bell was alive, its rhythm the heartbeat of the town itself. "Ilara," the voice came again, no longer a whisper, but a command. The figure of her mother appeared in the mist, her face pale, her eyes dark and hollow. "You've come this far. You've answered the call." Ilara's body trembled, her mind racing, with terror and confusion. "What do you want from me?" she gasped. "What do you want me to do?" The figure's lips twisted into a faint, cruel smile. "It's not what I want, Ilara. It's what the bell wants." The shadows in the tower seemed to swirl around, her reaching toward her, coiling in on themselves like a trap closing in. Ilara took a step back, but the walls seemed to shift, closing in tighter with each movement. The bell tolled again, louder, and she could feel her breath quicken, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean?" Ilara cried out, her voice breaking. "I don't want this. I don't want to be part of it." The figure of her mother stepped forward, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You've always been part of it, Ilara," she said softly, her voice cold, detached. "The bell doesn't give you a choice. It chooses. It always chooses. And now you must make the final sacrifice." The fog swirled around Ilara, and the tolling of the bell grew louder until it felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. Her head throbbed with the intensity of the sound, and her chest felt tight, as though the very air was pressing down on her. She stumbled, falling to her knees, as the shadows reached out toward her, pulling her into their cold embrace. "Ilara," her mother's voice echoed one last time, filled with finality. "You cannot escape the bell. You never could." The darkness closed in around her, and the bell's toll became a deafening roar, filling her mind, her body, her soul. And then there was nothing. The silence that followed the bell's deafening toll was absolute, suffocating. Ilara's chest heaved with shallow breaths, her body trembling, barely able to comprehend the sheer weight of what had just transpired. The shadows that had surrounded her seemed to vanish, but the air felt heavy with a palpable presence, something ancient, something malevolent that had been awakened. The bell, the curse, her mother's voice, and the strange, twisting figure, everything had become a blur of sound and darkness, swirling into an inescapable whirlwind. For a moment, Ilara couldn't remember where she was, or how she had gotten here. The fog that had pressed in around her had lifted, but the sense of unease, of something wrong, was stronger than ever. The tower, though still standing, seemed to vibrate with an energy that wasn't entirely physical, like the very structure of the world around her had shifted. She stood in the center of the tower, alone now, or so it seemed. The sound of the bell's toll still rang in her head, its rhythmic beat pounding relentlessly inside her skull. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, an imprint that had been left in her mind, seeping deeper with every moment. The walls around her seemed to pulse in time with the toll, like the heart of Bell Hollow itself was beating in the distance. Elara reached out a hand, her fingers trembling as she touched the cold, cracked stone of the pedestal where the bell had once sat. The stone was smooth, worn by time, but the moment her fingers made contact, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. Her body lurched, as though the very foundation of the tower had tilted, and she stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. The bell's tolling ceased for a moment. The world around her seemed to hold its breath, and then, in the silence that followed, she heard it. A whisper. Elara. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was her mother's voice again, but it was layered with something else. Something darker. Something that wasn't her mother. Something that had been buried for too long, now clawing its way to the surface. Elara turned, heart hammering in her chest, but there was no one there. The shadows stretched along the walls, twisting unnaturally like they were reaching toward her. The air seemed thicker, colder, as if the very temperature had dropped several degrees. Elara, this time the whisper wasn't just in her ears. It was in her head, in her thoughts. The voice was all around her, in the very fabric of the tower, in the walls, in the air. She could feel it crawling through her mind, threading its way into her consciousness like a poison. The tolling began again, softer now, but unmistakably present. The bell was still ringing, still pulling at her, still reaching into her very soul. She staggered forward, her legs weak beneath her, her feet moving of their own accord, drawn toward the base of the tower. The bell's power, its force, was undeniable. She could feel it now deeper than before. It was inside her, beneath her skin, in her blood. The curse was hers. The fog in the tower seemed to swirl faster, closer, until it obscured everything around her. Elara's pulse quickened, her breath shallow and ragged. She reached out, but the shadows enveloped her. She could feel them pressing in, tightening around her body, squeezing her chest, forcing the breath from her lungs. Elara. The voice whispered again, soft but insistent. Please. Elara gasped, the words slipping from her lips like a prayer. I don't want this. The shadows seemed to twist in response, forming shapes that weren't quite human, but not quite otherworldly either. They were distorted reflections of herself, flickering in and out of focus, like ghosts made of darkness. The bell tolled again, a deep, resounding note that shook the very air around her. Elara, you cannot escape, the voice said, now unmistakably her own voice, but twisted, mocking. You are part of it now. You always have been. She recoiled, stumbling back, her hands pressed against the stone walls of the tower, seeking something to steady herself. But the stone had become soft, malleable, like it was sinking into the earth, as if the very foundation of the tower was breaking apart beneath her. The shadows pressed tighter, and the tolling grew louder, more insistent, like the world itself was vibrating with the sound. No! Elara cried out, her voice desperate, raw. I can't be part of this, I can't be this. But the voice didn't relent. It was everywhere now, inside her mind, around her, twisting, calling. You are. You always were. You cannot escape the bell. The darkness seemed to close in around her. The figures, her own distorted reflections, reached out toward her, their shadowy arms elongating, their hands reaching for her, pulling at her limbs. Elara's body jerked, resisting, but it was no use. She was trapped. Elara, it wasn't just a whisper anymore. The voice, her mother's voice, filled her entire being. It was not a warning, it was not a plea, it was a command, a demand. The shadows engulfed her. The tolling grew louder, louder than it had ever been before. It was more than a sound. It was a force that had been calling her from the moment she set foot in Bell Hollow. She could feel it in her chest, in her heart, in her blood. And then it stopped. Silence. The silence was so profound, so deep, that it felt like the very world had ceased to exist. Ilara stood there in the dark, trembling, her body racked with exhaustion. The shadows had vanished. The bell's toll had ceased, and yet she could still feel it, its presence, its pull inside her. It was like a weight, a dark stain that had become part of her very soul. She gasped for breath, her heart still pounding in her chest, but there was no relief. The silence wasn't peace. It was a void. And inside that void, she could hear it. The bell's call, faint but ever-present, like a heartbeat that had been buried in her very being. Ilara. The voice whispered again, the finality of it echoing through her bones. It's done. And in that moment, Ilara realized the truth. She wasn't just a part of Bell Hollow. She wasn't just a victim of the curse. She had become it. The bell had taken root in her, and now there was no escape. Ilara's body was trembling, her mind too numb to feel the weight of her surroundings. The silence that had followed the bell's deafening roar still clung to the air, suffocating her with its presence. The world around her seemed to shift and distort, as if she was standing on the edge of reality, teetering between the world she had known and something far darker, something that she had never fully understood until now. The bell's toll had ceased, but its grip on her, its unrelenting pull had not. It was still inside her, beating in her chest like a second heart, pulsating with the rhythm of death and despair. She could feel it, a dark, suffocating presence that wrapped itself around her thoughts, digging deep into her soul. The curse was hers now, bound to her as tightly as the blood in her veins. Her breath was shallow, her throat dry. She was in the tower, but it didn't feel like the same place anymore. The walls, once cracked and worn, seemed to be alive, shifting and groaning under the weight of some unseen force. The fog had returned, swirling in thick, unnatural clouds, and the shadows stretched across the room like fingers, reaching toward her, pulling at her. The entire tower seemed to hum with energy, a strange, eerie vibration that sent chills down her spine. Ilara. The voice, familiar and haunting, whispered through the fog, weaving itself into the very air around her. Her mother's voice. She could hear the words clearly now, but they were different, distant, cold, and yet filled with something darker, something twisted. It was as though her mother's voice had been warped by the curse, distorted by the bell's unyielding power. Ilara, you can't run from it. Ilara's chest tightened as she turned, her eyes scanning the room. But there was no one there. The tower was empty, except for her and the bell. The fog swirled around her feet and the shadows danced in the corners, but she couldn't see anyone. Only the ever-present presence of the bell, still resonating in the very air around her like a heartbeat that wouldn't stop. She had tried to run. She had tried to escape, to fight back, but every step she took only drew her closer to it. The bell had always been there, a constant in her life, pulling at her from the moment she was born. Her mother had tried to stop it, to protect her, but now Ilara understood the truth. It wasn't just her mother's fate that had been sealed, it was hers as well. The bell had claimed her. Ilara, the voice whispered again, and this time it was not her mother's voice alone. There was something else in it, something darker, something that wasn't quite human. You've come far. You've answered the call. The words hit her like a wave, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but her body wouldn't respond. She could feel the bell's pull, like invisible chains wrapping themselves around her, tightening with every passing second. She could feel the curse spreading inside her like a dark fire, burning its way through her thoughts, through her very soul. This is it, Ilara thought. There's no going back. The bell had already done its work. It had already consumed so many lives, so many souls. And now, it was her turn. She could feel the power inside her, the dark force that had taken root in her veins, coiling around her heart, growing stronger with every breath she took. The bell's curse had not just claimed her, it had bound her. Her vision blurred as the tolling of the bell began again, faint at first, then growing louder until it was the only sound in the world. The walls of the tower seemed to close in on her, the shadows pressing tighter against her body, until she felt as though she was being crushed by the weight of it all. The bell was inside her now, a constant hum in the background of her thoughts. She could feel it pulsing with power as though it was alive, as though it had chosen her to carry its curse. Ilara, the voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. You've answered the call. You are the final one, the last to bear the burden. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes as she stumbled forward, her hands gripping the pedestal of the bell for support. Her body felt like it was on fire, her chest constricted with an unbearable pressure. The shadows continued to stretch and twist around her, reaching for her, pulling at her, as if they were trying to drag her down into some endless abyss. But she couldn't move. She couldn't escape. Ilara, there is no escape, the voice whispered once more. This is the price. This is the fate of all who answer the bell's call. She closed her eyes, her body shaking with the force of it. The tolling grew louder still, deafening, overwhelming. The shadows around her twisted and writhed like serpents, their forms becoming more solid, more real, until Ilara could see the faces, twisted, contorted faces trapped in the bell's curse, their eyes hollow and lost. Her mother's face appeared before her, not the loving face she remembered, but a pale, ghostly reflection, her eyes wide with terror. Ilara, you must make the final choice, her mother's ghost whispered. You must offer yourself to the bell, or all will be lost. The words struck Ilara like a blow, sending her sprawling to the ground. The world around her spun, her mind fractured by the weight of her mother's final words. She wanted to scream, wanted to fight, but she couldn't. The bell was too strong. The curse had already claimed her, and now there was no way out. Ilara, she turned her head to see the ghostly figure of her mother standing before her, her arms outstretched. But the figure wasn't just her mother anymore. It had become something else, something worse, something that wasn't human at all. The Raiji shadows had consumed her mother's spirit, twisting her into a hollow, corrupted form, a being bound to the bell, just as Ilara now was. The bell tolled once more, its sound now deafening, and Ilara realized the truth. Her mother's sacrifice, her choice to bind the bell, had never been enough. The bell had always required more. And now, it was her turn. With a final desperate scream, Ilara fell to her knees, the bell's power surging through her, the weight of the curse consuming her from the inside out. She had made the choice, and now the bell had claimed her. The tolling of the bell never stopped. It had become a constant in Ilara's mind, a deafening rhythm that vibrated through her very bones, pulling at her, shaking her thoughts until they splintered. Every breath she took was heavy, like the air itself had been thickened by the curse that now coursed through her veins. Her chest felt tight, as though the bell itself had wrapped its invisible hands around her heart and squeezed. The darkness had engulfed her, and the bell's call was no longer distant. It was inside her. It was not just a sound. It was a presence, a force, a living entity that had burrowed itself deep into her mind. The shadows that once swirled around her now seemed to whisper, faint voices rising from the void, their words indistinguishable, lost in the endless tolling. Her body trembled, and her legs gave way beneath her. She collapsed onto the cold stone, floor of the tower, the weight of the curse pressing down on her shoulders, forcing the breath from her lungs. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape them, the faces. The twisted faces. They hovered around her, their eyes hollow, their mouths stretched in silent screams, all bound to the bell, just as she now was. Each face was a soul lost, consumed by the bell, cursed to remain trapped within its endless resonance. The tolling had already claimed so many, and now it had claimed her. Elara could feel them, those souls pressing in on her, their invisible fingers grasping at her, pulling at her thoughts. They whispered of the past, of the curse that had bound Bell Hollow for generations, of the price that had been paid by those before her. They whispered of sacrifice. It was a memory, one that had been buried deep within her mind, one that had been suppressed for so long. She could see it now, feel it, like a vision forcing itself into the forefront of her consciousness. Her mother's face, pale and worn, standing in the center of the tower. Her mother had always known. She had known what the bell demanded. She had tried to stop it, tried to keep Elara safe, but in the end, she had made the same mistake that everyone before her had made. She had given in to the bell's call. Elara's breath caught in her throat, the memory growing clearer, more vivid. Her mother had stood at the altar, her hands trembling as she raised them to the bell, to the source of the curse that had haunted Bell Hollow for centuries. Her mother had been part of a ritual, one that was meant to silence the bell forever. But the ritual had been incomplete. Its power had been too much for her mother to bear, and the bell had claimed her. It had consumed her, and now it was consuming Elara. The memory cracked open wider, like a door that had been locked for too long, and she saw it. The truth. Her mother hadn't just tried to protect her. She had tried to bury the curse, to lock it away, to sever the town from its fate. But the bell was a force of nature, and its roots ran deep. Her mother had been one of the keepers of the curse, bound to it, just like all the others before her. The bell wasn't just a curse, it was a prison, and Elara was its newest prisoner. Elara. The voice of her mother echoed in the darkness. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, an order, pulling her into the past, into the moment of the ritual. Her vision shifted. She saw her mother kneeling before the altar, her hands raised to the bell, offering herself, her life to silence it. But it had been a false hope. The bell didn't care about sacrifice. It didn't care about stopping. It only cared about consuming. Elara's chest tightened as she watched the memory unfold, her mind reeling with the horror of it. Her mother's face, a mask of anguish, twisted in pain as the bell took her, as it wrapped itself around her soul and bound her to it. It had been too late. Her mother had known deep down that the curse could never be defeated. It was never meant to be. The bell chose. It always chose. And once it had claimed its victim, there was no going back. Elara, you're the last, her mother's voice whispered, growing clearer, more distinct. You are the final piece. The bell needs you. The tolling of the bell began again. Softer now, like a distant hum, but its presence was overwhelming. It was in her mind, in her body, in her very soul. The curse was complete. Elara, the voice continued, filled with a sense of finality, of resignation. I couldn't protect you, I couldn't save you from it. The tears that Elara hadn't realized she was holding back finally broke free, falling down her cheeks like rivers of salt. The truth, the weight of it, was too much. She had thought her mother's death had been an accident, a consequence of Bell Hollow's dark history. But it wasn't an accident. It was the price. And now, Elara was paying it. The fog around her thickened and the shadows stretched further, like the very air was being consumed by the bell's influence. Her hands trembled as she reached out to the pedestal, to the space where the bell had once sat. There was nothing there now, nothing but the faint, flickering memories of what had happened, the ritual, the curse, the offering. Ilara. Her mother's voice came once more, now sorrowful, regretful. You must choose. The bell will take you, whether you resist or not. But you must choose. You must decide if you are to become the final keeper, the final piece of the curse, or if you are to give yourself to it, completely, as I did. Ilara could feel the pull, the weight of her mother's decision, the burden of the curse now pressing against her heart. She could feel the power of the bell vibrating through her chest, through her very soul. She had always known that Bell Hollow held something terrible, something ancient, but she hadn't realized the extent of it. The bell was not a thing. It was a force, a presence that had never truly left, and now it had found its final keeper. Her mind raced, the weight of the choice pressing down on her. She could feel the bell, its pull on her soul, and for a moment she almost gave in. She almost let it take her completely. But then something shifted inside her. Her mother had made the choice. She had tried to sacrifice herself to the bell, to keep Ilara safe, but Ilara wasn't her mother. She wasn't going to let the bell consume her. Not like this. Ilara. Her mother's voice cracked, fading into the distance, leaving behind only the echo of what had been. The choice is yours. You cannot hide from it. The shadows around her began to recede, but Ilara felt the pull of the bell still, deep within her. She knew what she had to do. She wasn't going to give in. Not now, not after everything her mother had tried to protect her from. Ilara clenched her fists, drawing strength from deep inside herself. She wasn't going to be the bell's last victim. She was going to find a way to stop it, to break the curse. The tolling grew softer, quieter. The bell still pulsed in her chest, but Ilara was ready. She would fight. She would end this. The bell would not claim her. Ilara's body burned with an energy she couldn't fully understand, a raw power that seemed to pulse from deep inside her. It was like the bell itself had been passed into her, wrapped around her soul, and yet she refused to let it claim her entirely. The shadows that had clung to her, the echoes of her mother's voice, had faded for a moment, leaving only silence. The fog around her began to dissipate, but the weight of the curse still clung to her like a cloak, suffocating her, pressing her down. She could still feel the bell inside her chest, its tolling echoing in her bones, a constant reminder that she was tethered to something much darker than herself. But Ilara was no longer afraid. She had chosen the final keeper, the last soul. It wasn't her fate to carry the bell. It wasn't her destiny to become a vessel for the curse that had plagued Bell Hollow for centuries. And yet, she understood now. The curse wasn't just about death. It was about memory, about what could be forgotten. The bell had captured the spirits of the lost, the forsaken, and bound them to its toll. But it had also captured the town's collective sins, the sins of her ancestors. The bell's toll was their punishment, their curse, and now it wanted her to bear that punishment. Ilara. The voice was soft, gentle, yet it still carried a weight that made her knees tremble. Her mother's voice, the last whisper, the final plea. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence. It was as though her mother's spirit was tangled with the very air around her. A last, lingering trace, a final warning. Ilara's chest tightened, the tolling of the bell in her mind growing louder. Why am I still here? The question pressed at her, forcing her to her feet, shaking her sense of reality. She had felt the darkness within her, the weight of it, the way it tried to push her down. She had known she wasn't alone in this. There were others, memories, souls bound to this cursed tower. And yet, despite it all, she had fought back. She had reached inside herself, into the very core of the curse, and found something she had never thought possible: strength. But was it enough? The fog parted, revealing the bell tower before her, its shape shifting, warping, becoming something more like a blackened skeleton in the fog. The tower's crumbling stone facade seemed to groan with every breath, as though it too was caught in the final moments of this cursed existence. The bell, once silent, was now ringing within her mind, a loud, jarring toll that echoed through the hollow, reverberating through the very ground beneath her feet. "Are you ready to give in?" the voice asked, no longer soft and comforting, but dark, twisted. It was the bell speaking through her mother's ghost, her mother's essence. "Are you ready to carry it?" The shadows in the room thickened, coiling like serpents, stretching toward her, curling around her limbs. They were the spirits, the lost souls, tugging at her, urging her to join them in the eternal ring of the bell. "I will not," Ilara said, her voice barely above a whisper at first, but growing stronger with every word. "I will not become this. I will not carry the sins of Bell Hollow any longer." Her hands trembled, but she clenched them into fists, her nails biting into her palms. The bell had been the weight of her past. It had been the weight of everyone who had come before her, everyone who had sacrificed themselves to its call. But she had seen the truth. The bell was more than a cursed object. It was a manifestation of everything the town had done, of the sins buried in its soil, the blood that had been spilled. The bell tolled again, but this time Ilara's chest didn't tighten. This time the tolling didn't claw at her heart. Instead, she stepped forward. Each movement felt like a battle, like her body was being pulled in two directions at once. But the closer she came to the center of the tower, to the place where the bell had once sat, the more the shadows around her seemed to recede, retreating into the corners of the room. It was as if the bell's influence was weakening, its power beginning to fade. The very presence of the curse, the very weight of her mother's voice, seemed to be receding into nothingness. "Ilara," the voice came again, soft, pleading. "Now. You cannot escape. You are the final piece. You must take the bell's place." Ilara stood at the center of the room now, surrounded by the shadows, but no longer afraid of them. She was no longer afraid of anything. "I choose to break the cycle," she said, her voice strong, unwavering. She took another step forward, and as she did, the bell's tolling grew softer, almost as if it were fading. The shadows recoiled, as if threatened by her resolve. The tolling grew faint, distant, until all that remained was the silence that had begun to fill the air, a silence that grew with every passing moment. And in the midst of that silence, something inside Ilara shifted. The bell's influence was gone, the pull of it, the suffocating weight, the call. It was all fading into nothing. The tolling stopped, the rhythm fading until it was silent. The curse was lifting. But it wasn't lifting on its own. It was because of her. Because she had chosen to stand, to face the bell, to face her mother's legacy and break it. The last remnants of the fog dissipated, leaving the tower empty, desolate. The walls seemed to sigh with the release, as if the very air had been exhaled after years of suffocation. "Ilara," the voice came again, softer this time, almost a whisper, a gentle caress. "You are free." She couldn't speak. Her throat closed with emotion, her heart racing. The curse was no longer hers. It wasn't her burden to carry anymore. And then the bell tower was silent, not in the way it had been before, not in the oppressive stillness that had filled her soul, but in the peace of something released, something freed. She was free, but freedom didn't come without cost. And Ilara knew that the price of breaking the cycle was more than just her own soul. It was the very soul of Bell Hollow. The bell had claimed the town, but now she had set it free. And as she stood there, amidst the broken ruins of the tower, Ilara realized that though she had broken the curse, it would never truly be over. The town of Bell Hollow was still alive with its memories, with the sins that had been buried beneath it. There would always be echoes of the bell, whispers of the past and shadows that would never fully fade. But for now, Ilara was free. Ilara stood in the middle of the tower, her chest heaving with the aftermath of the battle. Her body felt like a battlefield, torn and exhausted, yet undeniably lighter than before. The tolling of the bell had stopped. The silence stretched out, filling the once oppressive space with a strange, eerie calm. For the first time since she had stepped foot in Bell Hollow, she was truly alone, free. And yet, the weight of her mother's choices, her legacy, hung in the air like a suffocating fog that refused to leave. She closed her eyes, breathing in the cool air, trying to steady herself. The bell tower, which had once felt like the heart of the curse, was now just an empty shell, a hollow reminder of everything she had fought against, of everything that had led her here. The shadows that had clung to the walls seemed to dissipate, leaving nothing but the cold stone and the faint echoes of a history that had been buried too deep. But even as the air cleared, the sense of something unfinished lingered. The bell had stopped tolling, the curse had broken, but the town still existed. Bell Hollow was still there, shrouded in the past, steeped in its own secrets. And Ilara, despite her victory, knew that the consequences of her actions were not as simple as silencing a bell. The town had been marked. Its history was entwined with the curse, and now that the bell had been released, she felt the town's pulse under her feet, a faint hum beneath the ground. It was alive, but it was broken. She glanced up at the remains of the bell tower. The stone walls were cracked, the foundation crumbling, as though the very structure had been weakened by the curse it had housed for so long. The bell that had once loomed so powerfully over the town was gone, but its absence felt just as heavy. The ringing had stopped, but the silence left a void, one that Ilara wasn't sure how to fill. Ilara, her mother's voice whispered, again faint but distinct. It came from nowhere and everywhere, a shadow of her presence that had never truly left. Ilara turned, looking into the empty space, expecting to see the lingering figure of her mother, her ghost still bound to the tower, trapped in the aftermath of her choices. But there was nothing. The tower was empty. Still, the voice echoed, like a haunting memory that refused to fade. Ilara, you have done it. But the price? Ilara closed her eyes, the weight of the words settling over her, her mother's final plea, the price. She had broken the curse, silenced the bell, and freed the souls trapped within it. But in doing so, had she released the town from its fate? Or had she merely traded one curse for another? The very land itself seemed to be scarred by the bell's presence. Bell Hollow had lived in the shadow of the bell for generations, but now it had to face the consequences of its own history. The bell tower groaned, the sound reverberating through the floor beneath her feet. The structure seemed to shift, its bones creaking in protest. Ilara took a hesitant step back, her hand instinctively reaching out for something to steady herself. The air felt charged, thick with the remnants of magic that had once held the town captive. The bell was gone, but its influence had left a mark, one that Ilara couldn't erase, no matter how hard she tried. As if answering her unspoken question, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. Ilara's eyes snapped wide open, her heart skipping a beat. The tower rumbled, the floor beneath her vibrating with a growing intensity. The silence that had settled over Bell Hollow was being torn apart, and Ilara could feel the pull of something deep within the earth, like a force awakening after centuries of slumber. The bell might have stopped tolling, but something else was starting, something she wasn't prepared for. Ilara. The voice, now filled with anguish, echoed once more, but this time it was not just her mother's. It was a chorus of voices, faint whispers rising from the ground beneath her. The spirits, those that had been trapped by the bell, those that had been silenced for so long, were speaking, their voices mingling in a cacophony of grief, anger, and fear. Ilara, you can't undo what has been done. The earth shook beneath her feet, and the tower seemed to collapse inward, the walls crumbling as if they were made of sand. Ilara gasped, stumbling backward, her heart racing in panic. The foundation of the bell tower, the very source of the curse, was starting to unravel. But it wasn't just the tower that was falling apart, it was the town. Bell Hollow itself was beginning to tear at the seams. No, Ilara whispered, her mind spinning. It's not over. The voices from below grew louder, more insistent, as if the very land itself was mourning the loss of the bell. It was as though the town was screaming out in pain, the centuries of oppression and bloodshed trapped beneath the surface, now breaking free. The curse had been broken, but the land had been corrupted by it for so long that it could never be healed. The damage had been done. Bell Hollow would never be the same. Ilara's legs buckled beneath her, and she fell to her knees. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she tried to steady herself, her fingers digging into the ground beneath her. The very earth seemed to shift and tremble, as though something deep beneath the surface was awakening, rising to the surface after being locked away for centuries. Ilara, the voice was louder now, sharper, filled with a sense of urgency that sent a chill down her spine. The ground rumbled beneath her, the sound growing louder with every passing second. She could feel it. A presence, something ancient, something dark, reaching out from the depths. The price. It was time to pay the price. Ilara, you must leave, the voice said, this time not her mother's, but the voice of someone else. A man's voice, a voice that had been lost to time. Ilara, leave. Leave this place before it consumes you. But it was too late. The tower had collapsed, the ground beneath her cracking open like an old wound. Ilara felt herself falling, her body hurtling downward into the chasm that had formed beneath her. The darkness swallowed her, and the last thing she heard before everything went silent was the distant tolling of the bell. Soft at first, but growing louder, calling to her, pulling her into the depths, and then there was nothing. Ilara's body crashed into the earth with a sickening thud, the sharp sting of jagged stone biting into her skin. Her breath was knocked out of her lungs, and for a long moment she couldn't move, couldn't think. The ground beneath her trembled as though it were alive, groaning under the weight of something ancient, something that had been stirred from its slumber by the tolling of the bell. She lay there on her back, her chest heaving with shallow breaths, staring up at the jagged remnants of the collapsed tower above her. The dark sky loomed overhead, thick with the clouds of a storm she could not see. The silence after the collapse was deafening. It hung heavy in the air, pressing down on her chest, threatening to crush her beneath its weight. But it wasn't just the silence. It was the sense of loss, a hollow feeling that seemed to echo deep inside her. The bell's toll had faded, but the feeling it left behind still lingered, like a ghost brushing against her thoughts. She tried to move, but her body felt like it had been broken into 1,000 pieces. Every breath, every movement sent a jolt of pain through her limbs. The ground beneath her seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the very earth vibrating, as if something deep below was waking. The land itself was awakening, and Ilara could feel it in her bones. The bell's curse had not simply been broken, it had been unleashed. Ilara, the voice. It came again, soft and distant, but unmistakable. Her mother's voice twisted, by the curse calling to her. She closed her eyes, her chest tight with grief. She had thought she had freed herself. She had believed she had broken the cycle. But now, she understood. The bell was not just a thing of sound. It was a part of Bell Hollow itself, a part of the land, a part of the people. Its toll had echoed in the very soil of the town for generations, and now that it was gone, it had left a void, a wound in the land that couldn't be healed. Ilara. This time, the voice was not soft. It was urgent, filled with desperation, as if it was trying to reach her, trying to pull her back from something. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Ilara pushed herself up, her hands shaking as she placed them against the cold, trembling earth. She looked around, but the world seemed to be shifting, swirling like the fog that had consumed the bell tower. She could see shapes in the distance, shadows moving beneath the shifting ground, creeping toward her. She was not alone. Ilara, it's not over. The price. The voice faltered, filled with a painful, sorrowful tone. The price you've paid is not for you alone. The words echoed in her mind like a drumbeat, and the world around her began to shift again, the ground beneath her, feet warping, as if it were bending and breaking with every heartbeat. The shadows in the distance grew larger, creeping toward her, wrapping around her, pulling at her like a living thing. The earth groaned, the walls of Bell Hollow seeming to come to life, their crumbling structure threatening to collapse further. The price. Ilara's heart skipped a beat. Her mother had never spoken of the price. She had never warned her. She had tried to protect her, but in doing so, had she sealed her own fate? Had she sealed Ilara's? The shadows around her thickened, swirling, coiling like smoke, and Ilara could feel the land itself pushing back, as though it were rejecting her, as though she was no longer meant to be part of it. The fog twisted and howled, forming shapes, figures, faces, people from Bell Hollow's past, all bound to the curse, all reaching for her, their hands outstretched in desperation. The bell's tolling started again, but it wasn't the same. It was different now, faint at first, but rising in volume, twisting in pitch, as if the bell had been shattered into countless fragments, each one tolling with its own rhythm. The sound filled the air, not just as a noise, but as a presence, a force that seeped into her very thoughts. Ilara, it was her mother's voice again, but this time it was no longer a whisper. It was urgent, desperate. The bell cannot be silenced. It was never meant to be. Ilara staggered to her feet, every part of her body aching as though it had been torn apart. She couldn't understand. She had destroyed the bell. She had broken its hold on Bell Hollow, hadn't she? She had freed the spirits trapped within. But now, standing in the middle of the ruins, with the earth trembling beneath her, Ilara realized the truth. The bell was not just an object. It was a cycle. It was life and death, memory and sacrifice. It was everything. And she was the final piece. She had been chosen. She had always been chosen. Ilara. The voice, now no longer her mother's, but something else. Something older. Something darker. The voice filled the air, wrapping around her like chains, tightening with every word. Everything you have done has led to this. You cannot undo what has been done. The ground beneath her cracked wide open, splitting in a jagged line that stretched out into the distance. Ilara fell to her knees as the earth groaned, as though the land itself was crying out in agony. The bell tolling echoed from the depths, the sound now indistinguishable from the very pulse of the world around her. "No," Elara cried, her voice breaking, filled with a desperation she hadn't known she was capable of. She reached out toward the open chasm in the earth, feeling the darkness rising from it like a tide, pulling at her, trying to drag her into the void, but she couldn't let it. She couldn't let Bell Hollow and everything it had become consume her. She had a choice. With every ounce of will left in her, Elara forced herself to her feet. The tolling of the bell seemed to grow louder, more insistent, and the earth beneath her shook violently. She had to make the choice. She had to stop the cycle. She was the key. "Elara, it's too late." The voice was now a roar, filling her head, pulling at her very consciousness. "You are the last of us, the final sacrifice. The bell demands it." Elara felt the ground beneath her feet tremble with the power of the curse. The faces of the dead, the spirits, all reached for her, their hands desperate, pulling her into the void that had been waiting for this moment. Their eyes, hollow and pleading, burned into her soul. But Elara stood tall, her fists clenched at her sides. She wasn't going to let them win. "No," she whispered to the darkness, her voice barely audible. "I won't be your final offering." With a scream that shattered the air, Elara pushed forward, forcing the darkness away from her with every ounce of strength she had left. She couldn't fight the curse forever, but she could end it. She could stop the cycle. She could break the bell's hold once and for all. And as the tolling of the bell reached its final crescendo, Elara stepped forward, her feet firm, her heart steady. She would be the final offering, but it would be the last one. The ground beneath Elara's feet was no longer solid. It felt as if the very earth had become a thing of liquid, shifting and churning with the weight of a forgotten power. The bell's tolling, now a haunting, unrelenting rhythm, reverberated deep into her bones, filling her chest with a gnawing ache like the pulse of a dying heartbeat. The world around her had become an abyss, a swirling vortex of shadows and whispers, stretching and distorting as though the fabric of reality itself was being torn apart. Elara's breath came in sharp gasps, each inhale a struggle against the suffocating pressure of the curse that wrapped around her, tightening like a noose. Her mind felt clouded, her thoughts fragmented, disjointed. It was as though the bell had opened a door to a place beyond time, beyond space, a place where memories bled into the present, where the past had never truly let go. The tolling seemed to fill the void with its rhythm, its deep, resonant sound, blending with the screams of souls long trapped within the curse. The faces of the lost, the ones who had fallen before her, appeared and vanished in the fog, their eyes wide with desperation, their mouths open in silent screams. They were bound to the bell, to the curse, their spirits forever chained to the very thing that had caused their undoing. Elara, her mother's voice, no longer soft and pleading, but a harsh whisper that scraped against her soul. The very air around her seemed to hum with the energy of the words, pulling her deeper into the heart of the curse. Elara turned slowly, her eyes scanning the darkness that surrounded her. She could feel the presence of something watching, something old, something powerful, lurking just beyond her vision. The very ground beneath her shifted again, groaning with an unnatural force. It was as though the land itself was alive, a living, breathing entity bound to the bell. Elara, her mother's voice again. But this time, it was more than just a whisper. It was an echo, a presence. You can't undo what has been done. Elara's heart pounded in her chest as she reached out into the blackness, feeling the cold, damp air press against her skin like an unseen force. The bell, now a phantom presence in the distance, pulsed with a sickening energy. It was calling her, drawing her in, like the last breath of a dying world, a place where time and death were bound. Together. No, Ilara whispered, shaking her head, her body trembling with the weight of the curse. I won't let it take me. The fog seemed to swirl faster, growing denser, the tolling of the bell rising in volume louder, until it felt like it was inside her head. The world around her flickered, the shadows stretching unnaturally, and in the distance, she saw it. A figure, a silhouette moving toward her. Its shape was indistinct, a thing of darkness, but it was unmistakable. It was her mother, Ilara. The voice again, but this time it was filled with sorrow, with resignation. It's too late. You are the last. You are the final offering. The bell has chosen you. The words hit her like a physical blow, the weight of them crashing into her chest, suffocating her. She stumbled back, her feet slipping on the shifting earth. Her hands reached out, grasping for something to hold onto, but there was nothing. The darkness had consumed everything. The bell had consumed everything. No, Ilara whispered again, her voice barely audible, barely a breath in the overwhelming silence. I can't be the final offering. I can't become a part of this. The shadows around her seemed to grow, taller, pressing in from all sides. The figures of the lost souls swirling in the dark, their faces twisted in eternal agony. Ilara's heart raced, her breath shallow, as the bell's toll continued to vibrate through the very air, shaking her to the core. It was like the heartbeat of the curse, the pulse of everything that had ever been bound to it, everything that had been lost to it. Ilara. Her mother's voice again, now a wail of despair. You were always meant to be the final piece. It was your fate. You are the last of us. You cannot escape. The tolling grew louder, louder, until it filled every part of her mind, until she could hear nothing else. Ilara could feel herself breaking, feel the walls of her mind cracking beneath the weight of it all. The shadows around her pressed tighter, colder, until it felt like they were closing in on her, suffocating her, like she was being consumed by the very curse she had fought so hard to break. The world seemed to stretch, to warp. Time no longer made sense. Ilara could see the tower, but it was different now. The walls were cracked and broken, but they seemed to stretch into an endless expanse, an impossible distance. The bell tower was no longer just a building. It was a place, a nexus, the heart of the curse. And Ilara was at its center. No. Ilara gasped, shaking her head, her voice cracking. I won't accept it. The bell tolled again, louder, deafening. The shadows seemed to speak, their voices rising in an unintelligible chorus, as if they were trapped within the very sound of the bell. The earth beneath her feet cracked open, a chasm splitting the land, as if the very foundations of Bell Hollow were being torn apart. And then she saw it, a figure stepping out from the shadows. It was her mother, but not the one she had known. This figure was older, twisted, her eyes empty and hollow, her face pale and gaunt. She was bound to the bell, her spirit consumed by it, her body nothing but a hollow shell. Ilara. The voice was hers, but it wasn't. It was distorted. It came from somewhere deep within the bell, somewhere far beyond her mother's reach. Ilara's heart pounded. She couldn't breathe. The bell had taken her mother, had taken her ancestors, had taken everything, and now it was taking her. But there was one thing she hadn't yet realized. She was not just the final piece of the curse. She was the one who could end it. The bell was tied to the land, to the curse, to everything that had happened in Bell Hollow. And Ilara realized now that she wasn't meant to carry it. She was meant to break it. With a final desperate cry, Ilara reached into the shadows, into the heart of the curse, and grabbed hold of the last piece of power that remained. The bell tolled once more, louder than before, and then it shattered. The moment the bell shattered, the world around Ilara erupted in a violent surge of light and sound. It was as if the earth itself had been torn apart, and the sky above cracked open to reveal something beyond comprehension. A place between the living and the dead, between the known and the forgotten. The tolling stopped, its oppressive rhythm now gone, replaced by a silence so profound that it felt like the air itself had been drained of life. Ilara's chest heaved with a shallow breath as she stood in the aftermath of the destruction. The echoes of the bells shattering still vibrated in her bones, reverberating through the very ground beneath her feet. Her legs were unsteady, and she fought to keep her balance as the world seemed to shift around her. The shadows that had once filled the tower and consumed the land had receded, but the fog lingered, swirling around her like a living thing, thick with the remnants of the curse that had bound Bell Hollow for so long. The bell was gone. The curse had been broken, but the price was steep. Ilara's mind swirled with the weight of what she had done. The tower, now reduced to rubble, was just a shell of its former self, its once grand structure now broken and scattered, consumed by the very force it had housed for centuries. The ruins of Bell Hollow stretched before her, a town built on sorrow and silence, now waiting to feel the consequences of her actions. Ilara, the voice, her mother's voice, but no longer a whisper. This time it was clear, full of sorrow, but laced with something else. Relief. It was as if her mother's spirit, finally freed from the shackles of the bell, could now rest. Her presence lingered in the air, like a soft, familiar echo, fading slowly into the distance. Ilara, you've done it. You've broken the cycle. Tears pricked at the corners of Ilara's eyes as she stood in the middle of the ruins, the weight of her mother's words settling heavily on her shoulders. She had fought so long, so hard, to free herself from the bell's grasp, but it had always been tied to her. It had always been a part of her blood, part of her lineage. And now, it was gone. But the aftermath was far from what she had expected. The land was still, too still. The air felt too quiet. The silence was suffocating, like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something. Ilara. This time the voice didn't come from the past, from the memory of her mother's spirit, but from deep within her own soul. Her body was still trembling with the force of the bells breaking, and her heart was beating too fast, too loudly. She could feel the pull of something, like a thread that was still tangled around her. The curse might have been shattered, but something remained, something she couldn't shake. She turned toward the ruins of the bell tower, the stone debris scattered across the ground, the crumbled remnants of what had once been the center of Bell Hollow's torment. Something was stirring beneath the rubble, something deep in the earth. The land, despite being freed from the curse, still bore the scars of the bell's power. Ilara stepped forward, her legs unsteady but determined. The tolling of the bell, now a distant memory, had left a void in her, a silence she hadn't expected. It was a silence that wasn't peaceful, it was empty. The bell had been more than just a source of torture for the town. It had been a heartbeat, the pulse of Bell Hollow itself. Now that it was gone, there was nothing left to fill that space. The ground shook again, more violently this time, and Ilara stumbled, falling to one knee as the earth beneath her trembled. She gasped for air, trying to steady herself, but the force was too great. The rubble around her began to shift, as though the land itself was fighting to hold on to something, anything, that remained. No, the voice came again, but this time it was not her mother's. It was something darker, something more ancient, a whisper that crept through the soil, that seeped from the cracks in the earth itself. The ground split open in front of her, and Ilara fell back, her heart racing as a figure rose from the depths. It was a man, but not a man. His form was wrapped in shadow, his face obscured by darkness, but his presence was undeniable. Ilara's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the figure, the first keeper, the one who had set the bell in motion, the one who had made the pact long ago, the one who had started it all. He stepped forward, the ground beneath his feet bending and breaking with each step, his figure growing more solid, more real. The tolling of the bell began again, faint at first, but slowly building in intensity until it was as loud as it had ever been. The figure raised his head, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Ilara," he said, his voice filled with a terrible finality. "You have shattered the bell, but you do not yet understand. The curse was never about the bell, it was about you." Ilara staggered to her feet, trying to back away, but the earth seemed to close in around her. The man's words echoed in her mind, a dark revelation she wasn't ready to hear. The curse had been more than the bell. It had been tied to her. "You," she gasped, her throat tight with fear. "You've been waiting. You've been waiting for me to break it." The figure smiled, but it wasn't a smile of relief. It was something darker, something malevolent. "We all have," he replied, his voice thick with ancient knowledge. "The bell was never the key. You were always the key, Ilara. And now you have broken the curse, but not in the way you think. The bell was the cage. You were the prisoner." The tolling of the bell grew louder until it felt as though the very ground was shaking, vibrating with the power of the bell's influence. The man's form seemed to grow stronger, more powerful, as if the bell's shattered remnants had given him new life. "You have freed the souls," the man said, his voice rising. "But you have also unlocked something else. The land is alive, Ilara, and it remembers. You cannot undo the damage that has been done. The curse has no end. It was never meant to end." Ilara felt the darkness closing in around her, the shadows creeping toward her, pressing against her skin like a heavy weight. She could feel it. The land's twisted, ancient hunger, its insatiable need to reclaim what had been stolen. She closed her eyes, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The bell was gone, but the curse had never been just about the bell. It had been about control. And now the land was free, but it was free to do what it had always done: consume, devour, and remember. "Ilara," the man's voice boomed, as though the very earth itself was speaking. "You cannot fight what has already been set in motion. The price of freedom was never just yours to pay," and with that the ground beneath her feet shattered. Ilara's world erupted in chaos. The ground trembled beneath her, the earth cracking open with a deafening roar. She fell to her knees as the force of the tremors shook her to her core, her body unable to resist the pull of the land itself. The sky above seemed to darken, clouds swirling ominously, as if the heavens themselves were reacting to the violence below. The tolling of the bell, once a distant echo, was now a blinding, suffocating presence, reverberating through her very bones. It felt as though the bell's call had become a living thing, hunting her, seeking her out. "Ilara." The voice, once distant and ethereal, now echoed in the very air around her, vibrating with power, deep and ancient. It was a chorus of voices, too many to count, too many to name, their whispers rising from the cracks in the earth. These voices weren't just from the past. They were alive, their presence coursing through the land, reaching into her soul. Souls trapped by the bell's curse, now freed by her actions, but still bound to the very land they had once inhabited. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked up, eyes wide with terror. In the chasm that had split the earth before her, something was rising, a shape, its silhouette obscured by the darkness, by the swirling fog. It was growing, its form becoming more defined, more solid. The ground quaked in time with the tolling of the bell, shaking the very foundations of Bell Hollow. It was the first keeper, the one who had bound the bell to the land, the one who had set this curse in motion centuries ago. He was not just a ghost, a lingering spirit of the past. He was alive, a being born from the very essence of Bell Hollow's suffering, resurrected by the breaking of the bell. His presence felt like a weight on her chest, pressing her down, suffocating her, as if the very earth had become his vessel. Ilara, his voice boomed, filled with a dark resonance, an ancient power that shook the air around them. You thought you could break it. You thought you could free them. Ilara's throat tightened, her body trembling with fear and confusion. She tried to push herself to her feet, but the ground beneath her seemed to shift with every movement, as though the land itself was rejecting her, pulling her back into the earth. "No," she gasped, her voice cracking. I ended it. The bell is gone. The curse is broken." The keeper's shadowy form rose higher from the chasm, stretching out like a spectre of death, his face now visible, twisted, pale and hollow, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. His form flickered and shifted, his body seeming to bend and twist in unnatural ways. He was no longer human, but a reflection of the curse that had haunted the town, a manifestation of the darkness that had bound the bell to Bell Hollow for so long. "You misunderstand, child," he said, his voice echoing through the ruins of the town. "The curse was never about the bell. The bell was the prison. The curse is the land. The bell was a key, and you broke it. You thought you could stop it, but you've only freed what was always meant to be." Ilara's heart thudded painfully in her chest. The tolling of the bell seemed to reverberate in her very soul, each note pulsing through her veins. She could feel it, the pull. The bell had been a prison, but now that it was gone, something had been unleashed. Something that had always been there, beneath the surface of the earth, waiting for this moment. The keeper's form loomed closer, his eyes locked onto hers with an unyielding gaze, as though he could see deep into her very soul. She could feel the weight of his presence, pressing against her mind, pushing against her will. "Ilara," he intoned, the darkness around him thickening, swirling. "You were always part of it. You were born into this. The bell was a prison, yes, but it was also a seal. You have broken it. And now, the curse will take its full form." Ilara felt the earth tremble beneath her again, a violent tremor that sent shockwaves through the ground, through her very bones. She stumbled, trying to stay upright, but the pressure was too much. The shadows around her grew thicker, swirling around her, pressing against her, suffocating her in their cold embrace. "No," she whispered again, her voice barely audible over the tolling. "I can't." "You already have," the keeper interrupted, his voice rising with dark finality. "You've freed them. You've freed us." The ground cracked open once more, and from the depths, something else began to emerge. It wasn't just the keeper, it wasn't just the land. It was the curse itself, rising in the form of countless lost souls, spirits, memories, people who had been trapped within the bell, now released by the shattering of its prison. Their faces appeared in the swirling fog, their bodies twisting and contorting, their voices screaming in agony, lost and confused, their souls shattered by the bell's eternal toll. Ilara, the keeper's voice reverberated through her, like a pulse she could feel in every part of her being. "You have freed us, but in doing so, you have released the heart of the curse. The land will never be the same. Bell Hollow will never be the same. We are bound to it, and now you are bound to us." The spirits closed in on her, their faces filled with grief, with rage, with sorrow. They reached out toward her, their hands outstretched, but their touch was like ice, cold and unrelenting. They were no longer human. They were shadows, reflections of the past, of the land itself. They were the echoes of Bell Hollow, the memories of those who had been consumed by the bell, by the curse, and now they sought to claim her as their own. Elara. The voice was softer now, familiar once again, her mother's voice, but it was different. It was filled with an infinite sadness, a sorrow that Elara could feel deep within her chest, heavy and suffocating. "You are not free, my child," her mother's voice whispered, now a fading echo in the distance. "You can never truly escape the curse. You were always meant to be part of it. The bell was never the key, Elara. The land is the key." The ground trembled again, but this time the earth did not crack. It shifted. The land began to twist, the ruins of Bell Hollow contorting as the very fabric of reality itself began to unravel. The keeper stepped forward, his face twisted in a grim smile. "You have become the final sacrifice," he whispered, his eyes glowing with dark power. "And now the true curse will begin." The earth groaned beneath Ilara's feet, as if the very land were a living, breathing entity, desperate to consume everything in its path. The tolling of the bell, once a distant memory, now reverberated through her entire being, each beat like a drum that grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer just a sound, it was a pulse, a heart, beating inside the land, inside her. The land had awakened, and the curse was no longer something separate. It had become one with her, rooted in her very soul. Elara's heart raced, the pounding of her chest in time with the tolling. She could feel the weight of the keepers, words pressing against her, dragging her into a place she couldn't escape. She had thought she had broken the curse, that she had freed the land from its torment. But now, standing in the ruins of Bell Hollow, she understood the truth. The curse wasn't something that could be destroyed. It could only be passed on, and in doing so, it would always find a way to keep its grip. The keeper loomed before her, his twisted form now fully realized, standing like a shadow in the center of the broken landscape. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, a sickly greenish hue that flickered in time with the tolling of the bell. He reached out toward her, his hand stretching like a dark vine, pulling her closer, as if the land itself had extended its tendrils to bind her. "You have freed the spirits," he said, his voice dark and low, like the rumbling of thunder. "But you have also set them free. You are no longer just the last piece. You are the new bell, the heart of the curse, and you will carry it forever." Elara staggered backward, her body trembling with the weight of his words. The tolling grew louder, and she could feel it deep within her. The land was alive with the curse, the bell's influence still rippling through the soil, through the air. The spirits of the lost, the souls she had freed, now turned toward her, their faces twisted in sorrow and rage, their mouths open in silent screams. "No," Elara gasped, her voice barely audible over the growing cacophony. "No, I won't let it happen. I can't carry this. I won't let it take me." But the keeper's eyes gleamed with an unholy certainty. "You have no choice, Elara. You never did. The bell was always a part of you, part of your blood. You were born to this, and now you will become it. You will carry the burden. The bell was never meant to be destroyed. It was meant to be passed on." Ilara's hands clenched at her sides, her fingers digging into her palms. She could feel the weight of the bell, now deep inside her, an oppressive, crushing presence, gnawing at her thoughts, her soul. She could feel the pull, the curse trying to claim her, trying to drown her in its endless tolling, but something inside her sparked. A memory, a feeling, a thread of defiance that refused to fade. She had broken the bell, shattered it, and she had freed the spirits bound by it. She had done something that no one before her had ever done. But now, standing on the precipice of the curse's final manifestation, Ilara knew that breaking the bell hadn't been the end. It had been the beginning. She wasn't just going to be its vessel. Ilara raised her head, her eyes locking onto the keepers as he stepped closer. His twisted form, once a shadow, was now fully formed, towering over her like a dark god, his presence suffocating her. The spirits of the lost swirled around them, their eyes fixed on her, waiting for her to make her final decision. Ilara's breath came in short gasps, but her chest was steadying now, her mind sharpening. "I am not your final offering," Ilara said, her voice firm, though it trembled with the weight of what she was about to do. "I am not a part of your curse. I'm not going to carry it." The keeper's face twisted into a grotesque smile, his lips curling as if mocking her defiance. "You will carry it, Ilara. You were born for this. You cannot fight your blood. The curse has already taken root in you." The air around them crackled with dark energy, the tolling growing louder, rising with the intensity of the curse. Ilara could feel it. A storm was building, the darkness tightening around her like a noose. She was standing on the edge of something vast, something that stretched beyond Bell Hollow, beyond the earth itself. The keeper's eyes glinted with power, his hand still outstretched toward her, ready to claim her. But Ilara closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out the growing noise, the pressure. She could still feel the land's power, its heartbeat, but she refused to let it consume her. She had always been tied to this land, but now she understood. It was her choice. It was always her choice. With a final desperate cry, she pressed her hands to her chest, feeling the pulse of the curse inside her, the force of the bell's call. But instead of letting it take her, she willed herself to break it. Her fingers trembled, but her resolve held steady as she whispered the words to herself. Words that had been buried deep in her soul. Words that she had not realized she needed. To say until now, "I choose to end this." Her chest tightened as a surge of energy shot through her, a bright, blinding force that exploded outward from within her. It was as though her very soul had ignited, burning away the curse that had taken root in her. The tolling of the bell, once deafening, began to crack and splinter, its sound growing more distant, more distorted, until it finally shattered, fading into nothingness. The keeper screamed, a harsh, guttural sound that echoed through the land. But Ilara held firm. The spirits of the lost seemed to cry out as the curse began to unravel, their forms fading into the air, dissipating like smoke. The land itself seemed to tremble as the last remnants of the curse began to break apart, the weight lifting from Bell Hollow. The keeper's form flickered, his eyes widening in disbelief as the darkness around him began to unravel. "No, you can't. You won't." But Ilara, her heart beating in the silence that followed, stepped forward, her hands still pressed to her chest, where the last echoes of the bell had once resided. The land groaned beneath her feet as she let the darkness fade into the earth, letting the remnants of the curse bleed into the ground, into the air, and then, in a final burst of light, the keeper's form crumbled, dissolving into the very land he had sought to control. The tolling stopped, leaving nothing but silence. The land was still, and Ilara stood alone, the weight of the curse finally lifted, her body trembling with exhaustion. The sky above began to clear, the fog lifting, revealing the horizon. Bell Hollow had been freed, but at what cost? She took a deep breath, closing her eyes. The price of freedom was heavy, but it was a price she had chosen. The bell had been shattered, the curse broken, and now it was up to her to rebuild. The land, though scarred, was no longer bound to the curse. It was hers to heal. And for the first time in a long time, Ilara felt something stir within her, a feeling of hope, of possibility. She could begin again. The past was gone, and with it, the tolling of the bell. The final choice had been hers. Ilara stood in the middle of what had once been Bell Hollow, her body still trembling with the aftermath of the battle she had just fought, against the bell, against the curse, against the very land itself. The silence that surrounded her was deafening. No longer was there the tolling that had echoed through the town, the curse that had pulsed through the very ground beneath her feet. The air was calm, still, as if the world itself had finally exhaled. The fog had dissipated, the clouds breaking apart above her, revealing a clear sky that seemed impossibly bright. The ruins of Bell Hollow were still there, scattered around her like the remnants of a forgotten past. The skeletal remains of houses, the broken walls of the church, the ruins of the bell tower, all were bathed in the soft light of a new dawn, a dawn that seemed to signify something beyond mere time. It was a new beginning, a rebirth. But as Ilara took a slow step forward, her bare feet touching the ground that had once been cursed, she felt the weight of what had happened. She had shattered the bell. She had freed the souls trapped by its tolling. She had broken the cycle that had bound the land for so long, and yet, in the stillness, she felt the ghosts of the past linger around her, whispers, not of the bell, but of the legacy it left behind. The scars of the curse were not just etched into the land, but into the very fabric of Bell Hollow's history. The townspeople, the lost souls, the spirits who had once walked the earth, they were part of this place. They were part of her. Is it over? The question escaped Ilara's lips, but she was not sure she was asking anyone at all. She wasn't speaking to the ghosts, to the echoes of those lost. She wasn't speaking to the remnants of the bell. That still seemed to hum deep within her chest, faint but ever present. No, she was asking herself. She didn't expect an answer. The land had been freed from the curse, yes. The bell's tolling had ended. But Bell Hollow had always been a place of echoes, memories lingering, unable to fade. The past had shaped the present. And though the curse had been lifted, Ilara understood now that Bell Hollow's heart could not simply start over. Its history would never fully be erased. As if in response to her silent thoughts, a soft breeze stirred, brushing against her skin, carrying with it the faintest echo of a voice. It was her mother's voice, distant and faded, yet so clear in Ilara's mind. You were always meant to break the cycle, Ilara. But it wasn't just the bell that needed to be destroyed. It was the memory, the land's memory. The words resonated deep within her, pulling at the very core of her being. Ilara's fingers clenched into fists, and she stared down at the ground beneath her. She could feel the weight of the past pressing against her heart. The curse had been a weight on the land, yes, but the land itself, this land, had never truly let go. It would never be free of what had come before. There would always be traces of the bell, traces of the past, but Ilara knew that it was no longer the tolling of the bell that kept it bound. It was the memory of it. It was the people who had lived here, their hopes, their fears, their sins, that would always be part of Bell Hollow. The cycle wasn't just in the bell, it was in the stories, the lives, the very soil of this place. And no matter how much she wished it could be different, she realized she could never undo that. I can't undo it, Ilara thought, but there was no sorrow in her heart, only a quiet acceptance. She stepped forward, walking slowly through the ruins of Bell Hollow, her eyes scanning the remnants of the town. The houses were crumbled and abandoned. The church, where the bell had once rung with such power, now lay in ruins. The bell tower, though shattered and broken, still loomed in the distance, a towering reminder of what had come before. But as Ilara passed through the ruins, She felt the earth beneath her feet pulse with a faint but steady energy. It was as if the land itself, despite all the destruction, was waking, healing. She could feel the roots of life creeping back, pushing through the cracks, reclaiming what had been lost. The bell had been broken, yes, but life, real life, was returning. The land, as scarred and ruined as it was, could still heal itself. The air felt different now, lighter. The tolling was gone, but there was a new sound, a sound of life slowly returning. The wind stirred the trees, the rustling of leaves filling the silence. Birds, once driven away by the bell's call, now returned, their songs carrying through the air. The very earth beneath Ilara's feet was no longer suffocating. It was alive again. And with that, Ilara finally understood. The curse was over, yes. The bell had been silenced, the spirits freed. But the true cost of freedom was not in destroying the bell, nor in ending the curse. The true cost was in remembering. Bell Hollow would never forget. Its heart would always beat in time with the echoes of the past. And while the bell's toll had ceased, the stories, the memory of the town would remain. They would live on, not in a curse, but in the rebirth of the land. And Ilara, standing there in the heart of the ruins, finally accepted that. She wasn't meant to erase the past. She was meant to carry it. The bell had been a prison, but now the land had been set free. It was no longer a place of torment. It was a place of renewal. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath as the weight of the land settled into her chest. The earth had scarred her, just as it had scarred the town. But it had healed. And now, it was her responsibility to carry its memory, its history, and its future. She would rebuild, but she would never forget. Bell Hollow's heartbeat would be a quiet pulse in her veins, a reminder of everything that had been. The tolling of the bell had ended, but its legacy would remain, and so would she. With one last look at the ruins, Ilara turned and walked away from the heart of the town, toward the horizon that had begun to clear. The past would always be with her, but the future, her future, was waiting to be written. The silence that had once been suffocating was now a peaceful quiet, and with it came the possibility of rebirth, a quiet new beginning.